Chapter 12:21, Seal the Heavens. In the many heavens, there was a voice of admiration that said, "It is good." 1. There was a profound gaze full of something very wondrous. There was a paramount will, tranquil and calm. Thoughts converged peacefully, ultimately revealing a secret known only to the speaker. It is time for the Aurora heaven to turn the next page of history and let the next generation begin a new epic. Aurora, you were exceptionally talented to be willing to give up everything. Your son was exceptionally broad-minded to be willing to abandon all. Considering that father and son were both like that, I simply cannot measure up. The will of the many heavens was not perceived by the masses. As of this moment in the green heaven, as the Aurora Immortal Palace became an immortal foundation and fused with Xu Qing's immortal embryo, his aura skyrocketed. It became stronger and stronger, until it was so stunning it left its mark in the entire heaven beyond heaven. Eventually, as everyone looked on in astonishment, an indescribable pressure emanated from Xu Qing, something that caused everyone to instinctively feel the urge to bow to him. It was a sensation similar to what gods gave off. After ring source reached a certain level of density, it would provide a natural majesty to the lord of a heaven beyond heaven. The majesty caused Sir Star Ring to bow his head without even thinking about it. He, who had the legacy of fourth true monarch, also had karma tied to the Aurora heaven beyond heaven, and now that karma was converging on Xu Qing. Yuan Shensu trembled and tried to exercise self-restraint, but failed. The scenes from mirrored history flashed in her mind, and all of a sudden, Xu Qing became young Lord Aurora. Li Mengtu looked somewhat dazed as he thought back to his identity in the reflection of the Aurora Immortal Palace. Sir Vilespirit instinctively took a few steps back and put aside all thoughts of disloyalty. If they reacted in that way, there was little need to mention the other ascendees. All were shaken to the core. But the largest tempest was in the heart of Zhou Jingli. His eyes shone as he produced a piece of metal that he squeezed his hand down onto. The metal pierced his palm, causing blood to flow out. He also bit the tip of his tongue. Then he activated his cannon. After sending the blood from his tongue into his eyes, turning them bright red, he sent the blood from his palm into the piece of iron. And then he activated a secret magic. Using that secret magic, he looked at Xu Qing. Everything he had said before was true. He really did want to assist Xu Qing. He really did want to make a bet. And he really did know secrets. At the same time, he really did want to follow Xu Qing into the future, where he would make even more immense gains. That said, although all those things were true, he had another objective. And that was to get a clear view of Xu Qing. He wanted to see Xu Qing in his foresight. Even if it was an abstract image, even if it was blurry, even if he just saw a bit. He wanted to do everything he could possibly think of to catch that glimpse. That was his Tao. As soon as he looked at Xu Qing, a premonition of foresight filled him, deep and intense, until it formed an obsession. I have seen the Tao. My cannon can break through, and my cultivation base can break through. Zhou Jingli knew that, ordinarily speaking, his powers of foresight couldn't do anything like that, and thus he had waited. He had been waiting until this moment when Xu Qing was breaking through. At that moment, a tempest raged, heaven and earth sang, the starry sky shook, and the green heaven was radiant. The moment an imperial sovereign became a quasi-immortal was like the opening of a closed door. Even if it was only a small opening, it was possible to get a clear view of the world beyond. And so Zhou Jingli took advantage of this moment to open that door. And he saw through the crack. When he did, he shook from head to toe, and his mind filled with a sound like heavenly thunder. His eyes, nose, mouth, and ears gushed with blood. Yet he was laughing. It was an excited laughter. Within that excitement was an extreme level of fear. An unfamiliar star rang, an indescribably terrifying broken face. And on top of that face is a throne. Sitting on the throne is a person. He's looking at me. He's, too. Zhou Jingli shook as his aura skyrocketed. Because of what he was seeing, his cannon was also rising to great heights. His cultivation base had previously been just on the verge of reaching quasi-immortal. What he had lacked wasn't ring source, but canon. But right now, his canon was improving, and his immortal embryo was erupting. He was now rising to the level of quasi-immortal. A thick fog was building up around him, which was a manifestation of his canon, and contained the same secrets as his Tao. Because of it, no one could see his breakthrough. However, the other ascendees could sense what was happening, leading to even further astonishment. Xu Qing didn't care. He opened his eyes. They seemed to contain rivers of stars, universes. His eyes held whirlpools of stars. It was extremely majestic. The entire heaven beyond heaven was full of rumbling sounds. Countless species dropped to their knees in their ancestral lands. Everyone was shaking. And that was because, when Xu Qing opened his eyes, a pair of eyes appeared within the heaven beyond heaven, above the heads of all living beings and all inanimate objects. They looked down on the green heaven. They were Xu Qing's eyes. By means of his authority over the immortal palace, he was looking at all things. It was a gaze of omniscience. Xu Qing saw countless things. He saw all the universes in the heaven beyond heaven, as well as all the species, the god prisons, and the resources. After a moment, he sighed in his heart. He retracted his gaze. The aurora heaven beyond heaven had been without a lord for years, and thus, the local species had descended into chaos and disorder. Weak species had long since been wiped out, while the strong species eventually developed karma with other heavens beyond heaven. As for the god prisons, there were varying circumstances with the wardens and jailers. For the most part, most were unsupervised. There were no longer any god prisons with true gods in them. After all, ring source was the first thing people would want to seize. And of course, it would be taken away to other heavens beyond heaven. In some ways, the Heliodora universe was like a microcosm of the entire heaven beyond heaven. It seems that the Heliodora universe had a true god imprisoned because of that lower immortal. For whatever reason, he didn't feel like expending the effort to take it away, so he left it here. Xu Qing didn't say anything. All the things that had been taken away weren't necessarily lost forever. He could theoretically take them back. Unfortunately, he would need to be a lot stronger to deal with such situations, and he needed time. Right now, he didn't have either of those things. After some thought, his eyes glittered. Then he spoke coolly, in a voice that filled the green heaven. In 1 hour, these heavens will be sealed. During that time, any species that wishes to leave may do so. I won't force you to stay. However, though you may leave, you may not take any resources with you. It seemed meaningless to Xu Qing to force species to stay behind if they had backers in other heavens beyond heaven. The past was the past, and it had nothing to do with him. What he wanted was a heaven beyond heaven that was devoid of chaos. If a lot of species left, this place would also be empty of life. But at least it would be pure. It made a lot more sense to just let the species leave than try to force them to stay. He then opened up the right to leave. Before long, many species had contacted their backers and were starting to leave. Time passed by. Although an hour wasn't much time, it was enough for them to teleport out. The time limit arrived. The immortal palace within Xu Qing trembled. His voice echoed out. Heavens be sealed. Light flowed through the heavens, spreading out from Xu Qing, moving at incredible speed through all of the universes. After the entire heaven beyond heaven was covered, the right to leave was closed. The starry sky was sealed. From then on, unless someone was given the right by Xu Qing, they couldn't leave this heaven beyond heaven. Around this time, the fog around Zhou Jingli began to dissipate, and a figure emerged, step by step. He was no longer an imperial sovereign. He was a quasi-immortal. And yet, he still had the same obsequious smile on his face as he bowed deeply to Xu Qing. Congratulations, Lord of Green Heaven. Everyone present, regardless of what faction they sided with, or what their background was, rose and bowed. It was a way of showing respect and approval of the entire heaven beyond heaven. Xu Qing looked at Zhou Jingli. A moment later, he coolly said, "We can leave now." Though he had the immortal palace as a foundation, and owned this entire heaven beyond heaven, They were reserve powers for Xu Qing. He still had an official assignment as an acquisitioner. Xu Qing waved his hand toward the starry sky. Ripples flowed out as a path emerged. He stepped onto it. Everyone else cleared their minds and followed. That included Zhou Jingli, although he followed closely behind Xu Qing. As he looked at Xu Qing in front of him, a tempest continued to rage in his heart. He just couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The person seated on that throne, the one looking at me, was him. Ducking his head, he hurried forward resolutely. And thus, they walked along the path through the starry sky. The path bolstered them so that every step they took spanned universes. Eventually, they reached the far end of the heaven beyond heaven. They left. When they emerged, an unfamiliar starry sky met their eyes. This was the space between heavens beyond heaven, and it was known as the Heavenless Zone. Normally speaking, the Heavenless Zone was a barren waste. But perhaps because of the aurora heaven beyond, heaven being without a lord for so long, powers from other heavens had spread to here. The result was that it was a bustling place, with galaxies full of life and civilization. All of a sudden, the kelp plant sent out some divine will. "There's a god prison here with a lot of ring source." Xu Qing turned to look in that direction. Sir Star Ring and everyone else did the same, their eyes shining. They had not yet eaten their fill. They were still inclined to continue their travels. Now that they could sense the god prison, their hearts stirred with anticipation, and some of them turned to look at Xu Qing. This went beyond their mission description. Xu Qing pondered the situation. "There's a lot of ring source there," Sir Star Ring said, "and maybe even 9-colored ice." No one said anything, but their anticipation built. Xu Qing thought about it. It's not a good idea to use the same excuse too many times. Everyone stood there silently. Then Zhou Jingli's eyes glittered, and he quietly said, "Well, what if there was a prison break to deal with?" I'm putting his footnote here to explain the chapter title. Yes, the characters are the same as from the novel I Shall Seal the Heavens. So there were all sorts of ISSDH-related comments throughout this chapter from the Chinese readers. 2. I'm sure some of you will want to check back to chapters 965 and 465 to the chair reference. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but I'm sure some of you will want to check the wording. Note that in those chapters I used the word chair. I was very tempted to use throne in those chapters, but did not because throne is a different set of characters. In this chapter, 1221, the specific word for throne is used. So, take all of this for what you will. Chapter 1222, the strongest squadron. The calm holiness god prison was in the heavenless zone, in between the aurora and spirit light heavens beyond heaven. It looked like a statue of an enormous spider. The prison was inside the statue, while the outside had numerous palace structures. From afar, the palaces looked almost like nails, and they seemed to serve a sealing function. The statue itself was pitch black and as large as a planet. It was located inside of a dusty whirlpool of stars, and by means of its 8 long, furry legs, it would slowly absorb the scattered ring source that floated in the heavenless zone. The prison had been located there for thousands of years at this point. It was originally constructed when 17 imperial clans from different universes in the spirit light heaven beyond heaven pooled their resources. All 17 of those clans still had controlling interests in the prison. The gods inside had been collected by various means, from theft to purchase. In fact, many of the imprisoned gods were originally from the aurora heaven beyond heaven. They were almost like trade goods that the spirit light clans had managed to get their hands on one way or another. It had been constructed in the heavenless zone because of the unique characteristics of the prison. The gods inside of it had to be kept conscious to a certain degree. They couldn't be put into deep states of sleep. As such, it was not possible to build the prison in one of the heavens beyond heaven, where there was strong, immortal energy everywhere. Were the prison in an environment like that, the gods would have slipped into deep slumber. The purpose of it all was to study the undying qualities of the gods. The results were then sent to the spirit light, heaven beyond heaven, and were also recorded in reports in the Nine Shores, heaven beyond heaven. This also meant that the two heavens beyond heaven had joint jurisdiction over the place. That was why construction had been authorized to begin with, because two heavens beyond heaven had jurisdiction over it, and because of the special research going on there, the Department of Acquisitions had no authority there. In recent years, no acquisitioners had been sent there on a mission. That resulted in the place being very peaceful and quiet. The place was staffed by 2 wardens, as well as thousands of cultivators from the 17 clans that had built the place. At the moment, the sound of music and revelry drifted out of the biggest palace on the surface of the spider statue. Non-human servants were dancing and singing. There were even god-slaves who had the blood of gods running in them, who were currently performing on very ancient musical instruments. There were also servants in chains serving fine, ring-source-infused alcohol. There were a few dozen cultivators present, 2 of whom were human, and the rest of whom were non-humans. All of them were having a wonderful time. As for the 2 humans, one was an old man, the other was middle-aged. The former was from the spirit light heaven beyond heaven, while the latter was from the Nine Shores heaven beyond heaven. They were the wardens of the prison, and they were currently toasting each other and chatting merrily. Day after day, year after year, the 2 of us really do have carefree lives, Taoist brother. There's no end to the ring source. We have servants attending to our every need, and we're far, far away from the war. This place is like a paradise. Ha ha ha, living the quiet life. That's really the way to live. They had been on duty here for about 300 years, and things had been quiet and peaceful the entire time. They had benefited a lot, allowing them to reach the mid-quasi-immortal level. In fact, they were very close to the late level. Unfortunately, all good things come to an end eventually. We only have one 60-year cycle left, and then our term in office will end. We'll have to part then, and who knows when we'll run into each other again. Let's not worry too much about the future. We might as well just enjoy ourselves in the moment. Laughing, they raised their drinking vessels in another toast. The surrounding non-human prison guards smiled and joined in on the toast. Everyone was about to drink when, all of a sudden, a wind swept in from outside, filling the hall. It instantly cooled the bustling atmosphere inside. An ethereal non-human came in with the wind, eventually converging on a spot inside and transforming into a graceful female cultivator. Bowing, she said, "Exalted wardens, we've detected the auras of roughly 100 humans outside the prison. They're getting closer as we speak." The guards on duty outside told them to stop, and even activated the prison's defenses. But all of a sudden, a deafening boom interrupted her. The defenses had been shattered. Next, a powerful aura swept in from the outside. The cultivators in the hall reacted with surprise. The 2 human quasi-immortals frowned, then suddenly blurred and disappeared. They reappeared a moment later outside. When they saw the clothing worn by the intruders, their expressions turned grim. Numerous streaks of prismatic light were shooting toward the prison, pulsing with extraordinary auras. They moved with seemingly unstoppable momentum. 8 individuals arrived with mountain-toppling, sea-draining force. They slammed down right in front of the 2 wardens, causing the statue to tremble. A blast of wind spread out in all directions, all while more streams of light arrived. The non-human prison guards were arriving now as well, and they looked like they were ready to repel an invasion of enemies. Whether in terms of the number of people arriving or the level of their cultivation base, this was a shocking development. What was most noteworthy was that the arriving cultivators' expressions were unperturbed and even cruel. The one in the middle pulsed with a vile energy. He was the most terrifying of the group. The group immediately spread out into formation. It seemed clear that this group of cruel cultivators was a team of some sort, and they were waiting for something. It was the same with the fellow with the vile energy. More beams of light were falling onto the statue, all in formation. When they had all arrived, one final stream of glittering light appeared, pulsing with an aura that seemed to be that of a lower immortal. The non-human cultivators seemed astonished, and the 2 wardens were visibly taken aback. In the face of the mountain-toppling, sea-draining aura, they instinctively fell back a few paces. Lower immortal. No, it's not, but this aura. They struggled to control their breathing as the terrifying beam of light slammed into the ground. It resolved into the form of a young man. He wore black clothes and had long, violet hair. As for his aura, it was terrifying and soul-shaking. The entire prison was trembling. As the prison guards and the wardens trembled in fear, the cultivator who had arrived first, the one with the vile energy, stepped forward. "I'm Sir Vilespirit," he said in a raspy voice. "My exalted lord received a secret message indicating that a prison break is underway here. We came to get the situation under control." The prison guards grimaced. The two wardens looked fearfully at the cruel cultivators and the young man in black. However, they were still hesitating. "As the Department of Acquisitions knows," one of the wardens said, "this prison is under the joint jurisdiction of Nineshores and Spiritlight. There is no uprising at the moment." Standing next to Xu Qing was Zhou Jingli, who smiled warmly. "I take it you're one of the wardens, sir. Be at ease. We're only here to inspect things. If there's no uprising, we'll just leave." The two wardens were about to start yelling angrily, but then they looked at Xu Qing and hesitated. That was when Sir Star Ring stepped forward, bristling with a baleful aura. "We have a duty to perform. There's no need to waste words. Everyone follow me inside. Inspect everything thoroughly." Ignoring the prison guards, he led the way into the statue. A nod from Xu Qing was all it took to ensure that dozens of ascendees followed him. The prison guards' auras were in chaos. As for the wardens, they gritted their teeth and prepared to take action. That was when Zhou Jingli cleared his throat softly. Just as had been planned, the ascendees either unleashed unique energy fluctuations, took out identity medallions, or made loud exclamations. "Our master is the lower immortal known as Blue Mallard. The director of the Department of Acquisitions is our teacher. Some people call him Poison Monarch. Our bloodline goes right back to Old Man Talisman Sage. I have an agreement with the Chen clan to serve as a Dao seed. I was made a disciple of the human immortal sect. I'm in a Dao contract with the Divergent Mountain Heaven." Many voices and numerous beams of light from identity medallions shook the starry sky. The wardens' faces fell. Chapter 12:23, Unexpected. In any system that exists over many years, a framework will come to exist that contains multiple branches of support. Unless someone in that system has heaven-defying strength, they would have no choice but to obey the rules of the framework. And it would be almost impossible for them to affect the branches. After all, the branches of the framework would be outstanding and powerful. What was more, after the passage of dozens or even hundreds of generations, those branches would become inherent parts of the system and its rules. In the fifth star ring, the 11 heavens beyond heaven were the 11 strongest branches. Within those heavens beyond heaven were numerous powerful organizations that both protected their own home and benefited from it. They could also be considered branches, and they were like gigantic vortexes that exerted powerful gravitational forces that affected all of the living beings in the fifth star ring. Given that, why would any cultivator want to trifle with them? After Zhou Jingli cleared his throat and the ascendees spoke, their words became like incisive divine abilities and Taoist magics that struck the prison guards deep in their hearts. They were like boulders tossed into the sea. Every word left the listeners shaken to the core. Combined with the light of the identity medallions, it caused the non-human guards to feel like they were being struck with repeated tidal waves of shock. Such backgrounds, such affiliations. Even the two wardens started to feel completely powerless. This group was made of a host of silkpins, and in terms of cultivation base and talent, they obviously surpassed ordinary silkpins. People like this had to be ascendees from the immortal capital. Although there were only a few orthodox sects in the immortal capital, the reality was that the entire place was like a tangle of dragons and snakes. In other words, a hodgepodge of good people and scumbags. It was essentially a breeding ground for all the heavens beyond heaven, a place that was a mix of darkness and light. Someone might go unnoticed there for a long time, But after they reached their potential and left the immortal capital, they would quickly attract attention and be recruited. The two wardens were fully aware of how that worked, yet they were still puzzled by something. Ascendees were normally split up. They were never grouped together into one squadron. Yet right now, the two wardens felt completely powerless in the face of these people. The wardens couldn't compare to them in battle prowess. And these people had backgrounds that weren't even necessary to mention. And they're actually acquisitioners. Both wardens felt deep bitterness. Sir Starring was leading a few dozen ascendees right into the prison inside the statue. The mission was already underway. Sir Vilespirit, Yuanshan Su, Hordeslayer, and Rampart split up. Some went in on their own, others led some ascendees with them. Li Mengtu went inside as well. They went to different areas to divide up the work. Soon, only a dozen or so people were left outside. Xu Qing didn't need to do anything. After some thought, Zhou Jingli decided to stay with him. The kelp plant did not go into the prison. It circled around the statue and took over the defenses. It also unleashed its majesty and used its divine will to help the ascendees with their search. As the prison guards and the wardens watched the buzz of activity, they got the feeling this wasn't the first time this squadron had done something like this. And that was true. After working together in the Heliodora universe, they had learned to work in smooth coordination. As everyone entered the prison, Xu Qing sat down cross-legged to work on his cultivation base and think about what to do next. He knew that their actions were going to cause some sort of backlash and that he would be held accountable. He could think of different ways to deal with that, but the simplest was to find the 9-colored ice. That said, considering everyone called on their backgrounds, I won't be held solely accountable. Everyone made the decision together. Time passed, slowly but surely. Zhou Jingli also sat down to meditate. As for the ascendees who had remained outside, they settled down cross-legged, but didn't close their eyes. Instead, they kept watch over the prison entrance. They obviously wanted to go inside as well. However, according to the plan, there needed to be a watch outside at all times. Thus, duties had been split between everyone. As the wardens and guards looked on grimly, someone suddenly flew out of the entrance. It wasn't one of Xu Qing's squadron. It was a non-human guard. Kneeling in front of the two wardens, he said, "Exalted ones, they went inside and actually did start searching for something. But after noticing the imprisoned gods, they started interrogating them. And in the course of the interrogations, they started extracting ring source. There are already a few dozen gods who have been completely drained of ring source, if this continues." The guard hesitated. Meanwhile, the two wardens scowled and looked over at Xu Qing. One of them said, "Fellow Taoist, this is a private prison run by 17 clans from the spirit light, heaven beyond heaven. Given that we fall under the jurisdiction of 2 heavens beyond heaven, any theft here will be thoroughly investigated. We have been on duty here for years now, and we know the place like the backs of our hands. There's definitely no uprising going on. You're just using that as an excuse to take ring source. This is both outrageous and amateurish." Xu Qing said nothing. Zhou Jingli was the one who had come up with this idea. The ascendees who had remained on the outside weren't thin-skinned. They had come here for ring source, and thus their expressions didn't waver. Zhou Jingli, meanwhile, looked very solemn as he nodded and said, "That makes a lot of sense, exalted ones. My fellow squadron members are acting a bit boorishly. I'll see what I can do. Fellow Taoists, can you please head inside to oversee things?" The ascendees who had been waiting outside got to their feet with somber expressions on their faces. "I was just going to suggest that. They're acting completely out of line. We'll go in and get things under control." The ascendees flew at top speed into the entrance. The two wardens could see that something fishy was going on. Inside, they were more furious than ever, but they knew their battle prowess was insufficient to do anything. Then they exchanged a glance, and each could see the determination in the eyes of the other. They quickly had a conversation via divine will. "These people are far too presumptuous. This matter must be reported up the chain of command. The Department of Acquisitions offends people all the time, but this is pushing things too far. You and the 17 monarchs should report this to the Spirit Light Immortal Palace. I'll gather everyone else and report it to the Nine Shores Immortal Palace. These people might have impressive backing, but actions like these will definitely be punished. The two wardens immediately took out jade slips and started filling them with information. Meanwhile, the acquisitioners continued their work. Inside the prison, more and more ring source was being gathered, and the prison guards couldn't do anything to stop it from happening. After all, the spell formations in the prison were designed to work against gods. They didn't work against cultivators, and especially not against human cultivators. At the moment, in an area in the depths of the prison that hadn't been discovered by Sir Star Ring and the others, there was dense mutagen isolated in an area surrounded by glittering god talismans. If one looked at that area, they would see only a sea of fog. Astonishingly, there was an altar in the depths of the fog. It was constructed from the bones of gods, and there were 4 figures seated cross-legged around it. They had gruish bodies, undulating tentacles, and emitted the fluctuations of gods. The 4 gods were using godly authority to communicate with godly voices. Our secret plan has been kept under wraps by those inferior species for a long time now. His Majesty even implanted the 2 human quasi-immortals with his will, ensuring that they have no idea what's going on. In that case, how did anyone find out the truth? It doesn't seem like the intruding humans have sensed us, nor do they seem suspicious. They haven't found us, but at the same time, they're coming deeper and deeper. That's true. My divine will indicates that they've already started interrogating many of my people and have drained them of their essence. If things continue like this, they'll inevitably find us. Therefore, instead of sitting around waiting to be discovered, why don't we beat them to the punch? The 4 gods sat there silently for a short time. His Majesty hasn't returned. All we've done is issue the call. We're not ready yet either. If we take action now, before His Majesty is back, then we'll be in a position of weakness. But if we don't act soon, then any chance for return will be lost. We've been preparing for years now. Where did things go wrong? How could we have been noticed? The 4 gods again fell into silence. This sudden inspection had caught them completely by surprise. What was more, they could hear the increasingly chaotic sound of the humans interrogating the prisoners, and it caused their hearts to pound. If they just had a bit more time to carry out their plan, they would succeed without a doubt. Not only would their lord and master return, but also they could use that momentum as a way to get out of the 5th star ring. But now, there's no point in sitting around thinking. I agree that we should take action now. I second the motion. Golden light flared off the 4 gods as they joined their godly voices together in agreement. And then they reached out toward the altar. The altar rumbled loudly and let off a terrifying pressure. A golden tempest then swept from the altar up into the prison above. Somewhere in the middle section of the prison, Sir Star Ring and the others were collecting ring source from a god who was just on the verge of being squeezed dry. That was when a deafening sound filled the prison, and then mutagen erupted everywhere. The entire prison suddenly went dark. Howls echoed out everywhere. The gods were rioting. Sir Star Ring realized immediately what was happening. He was initially stunned, but then his expression turned grave as he cast his senses out. He immediately noticed the rising pillar of golden light. He also detected the aura of awakening. They're actually rioting. Sir Star Ring almost couldn't believe it, but he knew it was a serious situation, so he immediately sent someone to report the matter to Xu Qing. An incense stick of time passed. Atop the statue, the 2 wardens were in the middle of preparing jade slips to send to their respective heavens beyond heaven, to request that Xu Qing and the others be punished. Xu Qing sat there cross-legged with his eyes closed. Suddenly, his eyes opened, and he looked down suspiciously. At almost the exact same instant, 2 people flew out of the entrance. One was a prison guard, the other was an ascendi. They both seemed similarly anxious as they flew to their respective camps and made reports. Exalted One, there actually is a prison break going on. Upon hearing that, Xu Qing turned to look at Zhou Jingli. Zhou Jingli was visibly surprised. The furious guards who were waiting outside were similarly stunned. As for the wardens, their minds were reeling as if they had been struck by lightning. Instead of preparing jade slips, they just stood there, sweat dripping down their faces and their hearts full of incredulity. There really was a prison break. Before anyone could react, the ground trembled as golden pillars of light shot up. Mutagen began to build up everywhere. The two wardens instinctively looked toward Xu Qing, and by now, the dissatisfaction and anger in their hearts was almost completely gone. They knew full well how serious a prison break was. "Exalted One," they said urgently. They were still suspicious of why Xu Qing had shown up, but given the gravity of the situation, that didn't matter. What mattered was stopping the prison break. Xu Qing slowly rose to his feet. His cultivation base erupted, causing terrifying pressure to weigh down on the statue and dispel the light and mutagen. The statue rumbled. Then Xu Qing spoke in a grim voice. "We're taking control of this prison. Zhou Jingli, send orders down the chain of command. Tell everyone to immediately crush this god riot." Chapter 12:24. True God Awakens. The spider statue that held the god prison was shaking violently. A total of 33 golden pillars of light had shot up from within it, bringing with them intense mutagen and the pressure of the gods. This was the heavenless zone, where there was no immortal energy. As such, there was nothing to stop the mutagen from spreading rapidly. At the same time, godly fluctuations began to spread from inside the statue. Everything was devolving into chaos. Xu Qing's expression was calm, and his voice was as cold as a winter wind blowing from the 9 Serenities underworld. It filled the god prison and echoed in the starry sky, instantly calming the hearts of the prison guards and the wardens. The wardens didn't care what Xu Qing had been up to. Right now, his calm demeanor filled them with hope. Without any hesitation, they strode forth, bowed to Xu Qing, and handed over their jade slips, which gave them authority over the prison. They were obviously fine with him taking over. Xu Qing wasn't one to waste words. He took the jade slips, then took control of the prison, activating all of the spell formations and sealing marks inside. Then he looked at the wardens. "Is there a true god imprisoned here?" he asked them. Before the sudden development, they wouldn't have given him an answer. But now, they didn't hesitate to offer a full explanation. "There's a desiccated corpse that's being purified. It's the statue's true form." Xu Qing's gaze sharpened as he looked at the statue. The statue had attracted his attention when they arrived, and having heard what the wardens just said, he changed his mind about going inside. He immediately issued new orders. "The two of you go report this matter to the heavens beyond heaven. Position guards at all the exits. Don't let any gods out. Kelp plant, you suppress that god light. Send your roots into the prison to help them keep the gods under control. And have your true form contain the statue. You're our second line of defense. Zhou Jingli, you go into the prison. Have all the fellow Taoists in there get the gods under control and also find out what started the rebellion. You should all be fine as long as you don't run into a true god." Now, as for this true god statue, Xu Qing's eyes glittered with cold light. "I'll deal with it." "Yes, sir," Zhou Jingli said, and he flew into the prison to relay the orders and get to work. He had his ways of dealing with gods. Xu Qing paid him no further heed. Given what Zhou Jingli was capable of, he was confident that he would do a good job. The two wardens were also following through with Xu Qing's orders. One of them was reporting the matter, while the other was sending the guards to positions by the exits. The kelp plant appeared in the air, and its 12 leaves grew huge as it covered over the prison and blocked the golden light, sealing it. Its massive true form appeared in the starry sky, and it wrapped around the statue, all while sending roots down, some to block the golden light, and some into the interior of the prison. Everyone had their assignments, and they were following through in an orderly fashion. And thus, time passed. The surface levels of the prison were being methodically put under control by Zhou Jingli. That said, things didn't go perfectly smoothly. For instance, Right now, the howling of the gods rippled through the previously quiet prison. The howling came over and over again, and it stirred the ring source and caused godly authority to converge. The riot in the prison had reached a critical point. Xu Qing's eyes glittered as he rose up into the dome of heaven, settled cross-legged, and then looked down at the statue of the god. Circulating his cultivation base, he unleashed his quasi-immortal power. Terrifying might spread out. The void rippled, everything blurred, natural laws transformed, and spacetime was affected. Then, in response to his thoughts, his immortal embryo appeared externally. It started out only a few meters tall, but it rapidly grew larger until it seemed to fill heaven and earth. It was just as large as the statue, and it emanated a holy sensation. In its core, dazzling light stirred, bolstering the immortal embryo and making its immortal might even more weighty. Within that dazzling light at its core was an immortal palace. It seemed extremely ancient but boundlessly paramount, and it was connected to a heaven beyond heaven. It was the Aurora Immortal Palace. The arrival of the Immortal Palace made Xu Qing's immortal embryo even more majestic. It was no longer illusory, but almost completely true and real. And the aura it emitted could topple mountains and drain seas. It descended toward the prison statue. Cracking sounds rang out from the prison as the mutagen it was emitting was suppressed. It couldn't spread out at all. The howling of the gods was wiped away. At the same time, Xu Qing's might filled the statue, spreading through the entire prison, going from the top to the bottom, level by level. However, Xu Qing had only just taken action when his eyes started shining. His immortal embryo's hand lifted and went into an incantation gesture. Powerful streams of ring source converged as the immortal embryo rapidly grew stronger. An iron skewer appeared next to Xu Qing, thrumming as it powered up. It emanated a sense of sharpness that seemed capable of piercing anything and everything. The cannon of parallelism erupted, causing innumerable spacetimes to overlap around Xu Qing. All of it could be referred to as supernatural phenomena. And anyone who looked up at the scene would feel like they were observing the many heavens. In fact, the spacetimes all had enormous versions of Xu Qing's immortal embryo in them, so that it looked like innumerable immortal spirits descending from the many heavens. It was only natural that there was also terrifying pressure weighing down. The guards posted at the exits, and the two wardens were shaken to the core. The former were trembling from head to toe. They were non-humans who had been conquered by humankind, and the aura Xu Qing was emitting right now made them feel like they were looking at an immortal. The two wardens struggled to control their breathing, as the sensation they were experiencing was far more profound. It felt to them exactly like being in the presence of a lower immortal. He's not a lower immortal, but that majesty is so close to that level. Both of them were sighing inwardly with reverence. From what they could see, Xu Qing and his squadron would have no trouble suppressing this rebellion by acting both inside and from without. They were right. The gods in the prisons had all been locked up, and despite their attempt to rebel, they hadn't really been prepared. Their haphazard attempt had fallen short in many respects. Before long, the godly aura shrank down, and things started to get quiet. However, Xu Qing did not relax. In contrast, his gaze grew sharper, and he continued to gather energy. The reason was that he could sense there was a deeply hidden aura of awakening in the statue. It was not his first time sensing something like this. Back in the outer sea of the revered ancient mainland, eldest brother and I worked with Bai Xiaochun as bait, all to help him on a fishing expedition. Specifically, he was fishing for a returning true god. What I'm sensing now feels just like that, one. Even as that thought occurred to Xu Qing, the statue that made up the god prison started trembling, and a seemingly unstoppable force erupted from inside. Beams of golden light shot out of the statue, and the kelp's leaves couldn't contain them all. The aura of a god began to rise high. They became like pillars of mutagen. Chanting sounds drifted out of the statue, and they could distort the mind. Everyone who heard them reacted with shock. The ground started shaking, and then figures began shooting out of the various exits. They were the Ascendees, including Sir Star Ring, Sir Vile Spirit, Li Mengtu, Yuan Su, Hordeslayer, and Rampart. All had serious expressions on their faces, and all were wounded to varying degrees. Zhou Jingli was in the lead. "My lord, we got most of the rioting gods under control, but they had started a ceremony that can't be reversed, trying to wake up a true god." Even as Zhou Jingli's words rang out, the spider statue shivered and then released a deafening rumbling sound. Deep cracks spread out over its surface, and then the previously closed spider eyes seemed like they would open. A tugging force appeared out of nowhere, which turned into a true name. That true name became part of the chant, and soon it became obvious that a specific name was being called out. Bimosi, too. Bimosi. Bimosi. True gods were undying. As long as the name of a true god existed and was remembered, then even if that god perished, they could return. And right now, a true god that the cultivators of the fifth star ring had suppressed was returning. As the spider statue continued to crack, the cultivators flew off it, their expressions flickering dramatically. Xu Qing looked very serious. He was thinking back to what happened with Yu Liuchen. Meanwhile, outside of the prison, in the dusty void of the whirlpool of stars that surrounded it, everything was rumbling. The heavenless zone rippled and distorted as mutagens sizzled. And then a cold voice rang out that all of the cultivators present could hear. "I am Bimosi." The minds and hearts of the cultivators were thrown into chaos by the polluting sound of the voice. Many began to bleed from their eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Their flesh seemed like it wanted to peel off their bodies, and countless random thoughts in their minds began to converge into one singular thought. That was the might of a true god. Yet before the true god could finish speaking, Xu Qing's eyes filled with battle spirit. Years ago, Yu Liuchen, who was a mere altar god, conspired against a true god. If he could do that, then considering my current battle prowess, then maybe I can deal with an extremely weak true god who's in the middle of returning. Killing intent grew strong in his eyes. He shoved his hand out. His immortal embryo glittered. The iron skewer shone brightly. Overlapping space-time went wild. He had powered up and was now going all out. 1. Xu Qing and Erniu went with Yu Liuchen to the outer sea, starting in chapter 998. 2. Bimosi. This is a strange name invented by the author. It's possible the author intended for it to be something akin to a Taoist name or martial nickname, but on a gut level, it seems to me to be a proper name. Normally speaking, Bai is a surname. So the name could be Bai Mosi. However, the combination of the first two characters Bimo has a meaning in Chinese culture. It's the name of a shamanistic folk religion and also the name of the shamans who perform the rituals and rites of that religion. Because of that, I'm going to isolate Bimo as the surname. I don't think it's supposed to have any connection to the actual religion. It seems to me sort of like using voodoo in the name of some fantasy character simply because it sounds cool. C has many meanings, none of which seem important here, so I'm not even going to list them. Chapter 12:25, Bimo C, God of Pain. Meanwhile, inside the heavenless zone, as the god prison trembled, and the aura of a god proliferated, numerous streams of immortal were converging in the starry sky from all directions, and none but immortals could sense them. They were patrolling immortals from the nine shores and spirit-light heavens beyond heaven. They had sensed the disturbance and had come to re-establish order. However, the moment their immortal wills took shape, a calm voice spoke to them. Let him try, and let those of this generation experience what a true god is like. The streams of immortal will replied in a shaky voice. We shall follow the Nine Shores' immortal decree. Thanks to the godly aura, the heavenless zone was shaking violently. Everyone was backing away from the prison and putting up their defenses, including the two wardens, Sir Starring, and everyone else. It was the same with the kelp plant. They knew full well that they weren't facing an ordinary god right now. This was a returning true god. True gods were equivalent to lower immortals. In fact, in their gruish nature, they were more astonishing than lower immortals. After all, the gods were the former rulers of this higher star ring, and as a result, they could naturally absorb ring source. That meant that they were much better adapted to exist in higher star rings than cultivators. Furthermore, they were eternally indestructible. Thus, when cultivators faced a true god, it was only natural that they would experience incredible pressure weighing down on them. Everyone present knew that, taking in the fifth star ring as a whole, the return of one true god wasn't very consequential. It wouldn't take much effort in the grand scheme of things to deal with such a true god. In fact, the immortal lords wouldn't even need to take action. They could just issue a decree to have lower immortals deal with the situation. But to personally witness the awakening of such a god, and directly feel the terrifying aura that came along with it, was still a monumental thing. The terrifying fluctuations distorted the soul and caused everyone present to tremble to the core of their being. Everyone was backing away as quickly as possible. With the exception of Xu Qing. In fact, he wasn't just refusing to back down. Instead, his battle prowess was raging, and his cold eyes were fixed directly on the statue of the spider. He lifted his hand, and his energy erupted. The iron skewer had been powering up, and now it glittered brightly. At the same time, all of the layers of space-time around him thrummed, and the immortal embryo behind him shone dazzlingly. He was going to try to slaughter a god. Even as he took action, the huge spider statue shook violently. The will of awakening was exploding. Golden light shone off the 8 limbs as the spider statue started moving. Golden light was the hallmark of the gods, and as it shone, the spider placed its legs in front of it like a shield. It was a shimmering screen of gold. Behind that shield, and behind the spider legs, the statue's eyes opened. They emanated cold apathy and even stronger golden light, which spread through the starry sky like a sea. The godly aura grew stronger. The chanting grew louder. The name Bimosi became deafening. He was quickly returning. At the same time, Xu Qing dropped his hand down. The iron skewer shot forth, piercing through the starry sky, its immortal light shimmering, all while unleashing terrifying fluctuations. This was a weapon that had been created by a lower immortal, and it brimmed with Xu Qing's quasi-immortal power. The attack also included his cannon, and it was backed by the might of the Aurora Immortal Palace and the associated heaven beyond heaven. Furthermore, it contained heaven's principle. Whether in terms of the materials it was constructed with or the power that filled it, the iron skewer was a superior product. Where it passed, the void shattered, and the starry sky filled with a succession of black holes. It was so sharp that it could conquer every obstacle. In short order, it appeared right in front of the golden screen protecting the spider. It stabbed into it. An intense rumbling sound spread out. But it wasn't able to pierce all the way through. It was blocked by the golden light. The statue was the desiccated corpse of a true god and was essentially a carrier. This true god was not asleep any longer, but was in the process of returning. As such, it was no surprise that the golden shield he generated was terrifying. In fact, not only did the iron skewer fail to pierce through the golden light, but actually the golden light seemed like it wanted to devour it. However, that was when a bell tolled. As Xu Qing began moving forward, he took out a bell that contained a scrap of will from a god lord. Its tolling caused the starry sky to shake. Cultivators and gods could both be affected by the sound of that bell. To varying degrees, their internal functions all slowed down. It also affected the golden light. It suddenly seemed to stagnate. The might of the iron skewer intensified, and it pushed forward with mountain-toppling, sea-draining force and a will of destruction. Pushing all the way through the golden light, it shot toward the forehead of the statue. It moved with incredibly explosive speed and stabbed into the forehead. The spider statue trembled. The cultivators off in the distance watched, their minds and hearts trembling, as cracks appeared on the spider statue. And then it exploded violently. That said, nobody relaxed. After the statue exploded, the aura of a god didn't disappear. The sensation of a return was still present, and the chanting still echoed in the area. It was as if what had exploded was only the surface-level veneer of the returning true god. A terrifying power suddenly arrived from the void. As it passed, the starry sky trembled and all living beings writhed. It was the power of a god. It was pure power like a starry sea, something that surpassed heavenly might. As it swept along, the godly chanting grew louder, and then the entire region began to fold like a piece of paper. However, the senses of the cultivators told them that the folding wasn't taking place in this starry sky. It was as if space in this area had two different levels. The first level was where all the living beings existed, while the second level contained only the crumbled statue. What was folding was in that separate, higher level. In other words, it didn't affect any of the living beings present, only the rubble of the statue. It didn't involve a single fold. In the shortest of moments, there were innumerable folds. Then the rubble of the statue disappeared. The godly aura from moments ago, along with the power of return and the chanting, all disappeared. The folds went away. It was as if nothing had just happened. The starry sky went calm. Everyone looked around in shock. It was too gruish, to the point where everyone had to wonder whether or not a lower immortal had suddenly arrived and put an end to the return of the true god. But it didn't take long before people realized that something else was happening. No, that's not it. The god, it's fleeing. Considering that Xu Qing was in the thick of things, he realized it before everyone else. Almost as soon as the folding began, the layers of space from his canon of parallelism began to descend. Using space-time canon and the power of overlapping universes, he suppressed everything in the area. As a result, time went backward in this part of the starry sky, and then all of the Xu Qings in the various space-times performed incantation gestures and tapped into their canon. Things were revering. The folds were unfolding. However many folds had occurred, that many unfoldings were occurring. To the sense of the onlookers, it was as if everything was flowing backward. The godly aura that had disappeared came back. It was once again possible to hear the godly chanting. The power of return came back. The rubble of the statue was visible again. However, its appearance had changed. It was no longer the same substance the statue had been made of. Instead, the rubble took the shape of numerous white balls. They looked like flesh with white fur on it, however. The fur was so long that it was more like white hair, and as the hair swayed, it almost looked like tentacles spreading out. All pieces of the rubble were like that. Each ball of hair emanated a soul-piercing sensation that inflicted bitter pain onto all non-gods. Xu Qing's face was pale as even his soul was affected. But then his immortal embryo stepped forward, enveloping him, and it grew even larger as it reached out with its hand. That hand was like an entire starry sky. An immense buildup of power existed in that hand as it slammed down. It was a vicious slap. Inside the immortal embryo, the foundational Aurora Immortal Palace glittered brightly. The light it emanated filled the entire immortal embryo, making it incomparably holy. The immortal embryo's hand was similarly majestic. As the hand slapped down, it filled the void and blocked everything. All of the remnants of the statue with the floating white hair suddenly stopped in place. This was not just the hand of an immortal embryo. This was the crushing power of the Aurora Immortal Palace. The hand fell. That was when strange things happened. The various streams of hair swaying around the statue rubble suddenly stretched out and connected to each other. A huge spider web formed in the middle of the starry sky, right beneath the hand of Xu Qing's immortal embryo. The spider web was astonishing. It filled the starry sky and was made of white hair. Every point of intersection was a piece of rubble from the statue, except the rubble had changed. Now, each piece was a severed head with an anguished expression on it. They were the heads of men and women, old and young, cultivators and gods. They were all of the victims slaughtered by this true god. All living beings he had cut down had been unable to flee in soul form. He had come to control them for all eternity, as they had become part of him. And now they had emerged to block the hand of Xu Qing's immortal embryo. When the two made contact, there was no rumbling boom. Instead, there was a sensation of resonance that swept through the starry sky like a tempest. Where the tempest passed, planets crumbled and asteroids were rendered into dust. There was also a powerful backlash. As a result, the hand of Xu Qing's immortal embryo was pushed back, and it even looked like it might collapse. All of the onlookers seemed astonished. Blood sprayed out of Xu Qing's mouth, and his gaze became razor-sharp. In his view, the gruish and majestic spider web was almost completely golden, and he could tell that when it was indeed completely golden, the return would be complete. I've already unleashed my strongest level of power, but I still can't stop this thing from returning. And this is a weakened true god. Xu Qing looked on silently. He was aware that Yu Liuchen had been dealing with a true god that hadn't actually returned. Clearly, this situation right now was very different. He knew full well that even if he gave up right now, it wouldn't change anything. Even if this true god really did come back, it wouldn't be some major event in the 5th star ring. It seemed entirely likely that lower immortals had already been dispatched to deal with the situation. In fact, he got the feeling there were already lower immortals in the vicinity. However, the fact that they hadn't taken action yet, well, it meant he might be able to get some more ring source. If he could suppress this true god in the process of returning, then he could continue to extract ring source. Maybe he could even build up a big stockpile for future use. Having reached the conclusion that this was definitely the best idea, Xu Qing's eyes glittered. I still have something to try. He released the full power of his ring source. Immortal energy surged, bolstering his immortal embryo and causing the rebuffed hand to grow stronger and bigger. Tapping into the power of his authority, he catalyzed the Aurora Immortal Palace. It filled the immortal embryo, causing the hand in the starry sky to reach 10 times its previous size. It was astonishingly majestic. Once again, it descended. This time, it was not a slap. The 5 fingers were splayed, like columns in the starry sky, and the hand reached out to grab the spider web. The moment the hand touched the spider web, blood sprayed out of Xu Qing's mouth from the backlash. The hand seemed like it might collapse at any moment, and the effect actually spread to the entire immortal embryo. Yet there was a crazy look in Xu Qing's eyes. His immortal embryo was in chaos, but it was still being powered by the Aurora Immortal Palace. Immortal light shone dazzlingly from the palace, becoming a sea of brightness that stabilized all the weakened parts and cast brilliance into the surrounding starry sky. Xu Qing was fully tapping into the power of the Aurora Heaven Beyond Heaven. It turned into an unprecedented long-range teleportation, and the range encompassed the entire surrounding galaxy. Astonishingly, he was turning this place into a battlefield on which to battle the true god. He was taking the carrier body of the true god and teleporting it into his own heaven beyond heaven. Once there, he could use the entire might of the heaven beyond heaven to suppress the returning true god. The power of teleportation surged. Deafening rumbling sounds echoed out, covering everything. And then Xu Qing, the immortal embryo, the hand, and the spider web all disappeared. Meanwhile, in the heavenless zone, the immortal wills that could be detected by only immortals were all shaken. Then they shifted their focus to look at what had once been the Aurora Heaven Beyond Heaven. In the Nine Shores Heaven Beyond Heaven, in the very middle of the Nine Shores Immortal Palace, amidst countless structures, was the Nine Shores Immortal Tower, which rose high above all else. Standing there was an incredibly majestic figure. He wore a robe of blue and had his hands clasped behind his back as he looked off into the distance. Bimosi was known far and wide in the 5th star ring as the god of pain, with godly authority that could inflict extreme pain on all souls and convert it into personal power. The immortal paragon once said that this god's illusion was only partly false. Some of it contained truth. Well, Xu Qing, I've given you an opportunity. Will you seize it and turn it into good fortune? Chapter 12:26. Missing out on 1,000 years. In the past, it was the Aurora Heaven Beyond Heaven. Now it was the Green Heaven. Within it were numerous majestic universes, one starry sky after another, and countless planets. They had originally emanated bright, dazzling starlight, but then, in an instant, the entire heaven beyond heaven, including innumerable planets, all went dark. It was as if the light had been sucked away. In the middle of the seemingly never-ending heaven beyond heaven, in a location that most low-level cultivators could never reach in a lifetime, was a massive black hole. That black hole had come into being out of nowhere. Above the black hole was a vast, ever-expanding spider web. It was made of white spider silk, and the nodes where the silk connected continued to expand outward, along with the roiling aura of a true god. At the same time, as that godly aura spread, all the heads in the spider web were calling out the same thing. Bimosi. 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 Sound was inherently shapeless, but the spider web had bestowed it with the will of a god, causing it to become strands of godly authority that converged in the middle of the web. A figure was being revealed there. It was half person, half spider. At the moment, about 70% of the body of the figure was the color gold. The chanting grew increasingly intense, causing the returning aura to strengthen. The might of a true god was flooding this starry sky. Xu Qing's immortal embryo towered over the spider web, its face awe-inspiring and its eyes glinting coldly. Astonishingly, its right hand contained a massive immortal palace that shone with dazzling immortal light. In the form of the immortal embryo, Xu Qing's gaze focused on the figure forming in the middle of the spider web. His hand fell. The immortal palace rumbled. The black hole was beneath the spider web, and the hand was above it. The attack came from above and below, and the entire heaven beyond heaven stirred. The web would be crushed. The half-person, half-spider figure suddenly looked up, and the gaze of the spider met Xu Qing's gaze. It was a connection of gazes, but also a clash of souls and a convergence of ring source. The moment the connection occurred, Xu Qing's vision flashed with light. Things went back to normal an instant later. Nothing had changed. The immortal palace was still there, descending to crush the spider web. The half-person, half-spider figure struggled, but he had not yet fully returned, and was not strong enough to fight back against the weight of an entire heaven beyond heaven. But in Hai's defiance, he fought back with godly authority and godly might. Xu Qing trembled. Blood sprayed out of his mouth. His fleshly body and soul began to rip apart, but ultimately, he was unleashing what his foundation was capable of by using the power of a heaven beyond heaven. He was paying a huge price, but the result was success. Deafening rumbling sounds echoed out as the half-person, half-spider figure was shoved down into the black hole. It was over. That was when exhaustion flooded into Xu Qing. He quickly sat down cross-legged atop the black hole that contained the suppressed god and absorbed the ring source flowing out. It nourished him, and at the same time enabled his immortal embryo to grow further. He forgot about the passage of time. He forgot about his acquisitioner mission. He focused fully on cultivation. The benefits were astounding. His cultivation base rose from early quasi-immortal, higher and higher. In almost an instant, 10 years passed. When Xu Qing opened his eyes, his cultivation base had reached the great circle of quasi-immortal. He felt like he was at the peak. It was like omnipotence. And as a result, when he opened his eyes, they were initially blank. He quickly recovered. Upon realizing that 10 years had passed, he remembered about his acquisitioner duties. After all, to cultivators like Xu Qing, 10 years of cultivation didn't count for much. I still have time. Next up, I need to arrange to get back to revered ancient. Having reached this point in his train of thought, Xu Qing's eyes glittered with determination. He stepped out of the heaven beyond heaven, and when he appeared outside, he was in the heavenless zone where the spider statue had been. The statue had disappeared. The prison was no longer there. The wardens and prison guards were long gone. However, Sir Star Ring and the others had not left. They were waiting there. Upon seeing Xu Qing, their expressions flickered. They left together. Upon returning to the Department of Acquisitions, they handed in their mission. After that, they were given a host of additional missions. As a result, their squadron became well known throughout the Nine Shores heaven beyond heaven. Before long, they were transferred to the front lines of the war. Their squadron quickly began to perform meritorious services on the battlefield between the 4th and 5th star rings. They even captured a goddess. That goddess was the daughter and only child of a god lord. 1. Because of all the services rendered, Xu Qing's prestige skyrocketed. What was more, word spread that the Aurora heaven beyond heaven now belonged to him. It took no time at all for Xu Qing's name to ring in the ears of countless cultivators. Although it seemed like time was passing slowly, to Xu Qing, it was speeding by. Eventually, he got a mission that led to an encounter with a god lord from the 4th star ring. Although he was capable of fighting lower immortals, he couldn't possibly win a fight like that. The other cultivators in his squadron all died. He was seriously injured to the point where he nearly died. He fled into space-time but was chased. Eventually, he chose to enter the chaotic sea of space-time. Within that boundless chaos, he disappeared, too. Although he managed to escape death, he suffered grievous injuries in the chaotic sea of space-time. He lost consciousness and then drifted through the chaos into the depths of space-time. He had no idea how much time passed before he woke up. It took a lot of struggle and some luck as well, but after experiencing countless setbacks, he managed to free himself. He eventually got back to the point where he had left. He emerged into the world. Upon returning, he found that the war still raged. But then, a terrifying truth became evident when he returned to the camp. It was a truth that caused him to tremble with disbelief. He found that from the time he had gone missing until now, 1,000 years had passed. That truth filled him with extreme anxiety, perhaps even dread. He immediately left the battlefield and used the means he had at hand to leave the 5th star ring and return to Revered Ancient. He didn't dare to wonder what Revered Ancient would look like. 1,000 years had passed. He had missed out on 1,000 years. Soon, he hovered in the dome of heaven above Revered Ancient. His face fell. Revered Ancient looked very different compared to how he had left it. Gods were everywhere. Humans were extinct. Empress Summer Departure was nowhere to be seen. He went to his former haunts in the lands of humans. He went to the entrance to Brilliant Heaven, only to find that the entrance had collapsed. He went to the continent of South Phoenix. He went to the Sea of Endlessness. Huang Yan had perished. Xu Qing took it all in silently. Then a sigh echoed in his ears. It was a familiar sigh. He turned and saw an old woman standing next to him. She looked vaguely familiar. Floating next to her was a frail butterfly. "Before Master withered into death," the old woman said in a hoarse voice, "she said that you promised to come back in time. 1,000 years have passed. You're far too late. So, what exactly is the point of coming back now?" She had once been the apprentice of the palace lord of the Summer Immortal Palace. She had been a little butterfly. 3. 1. The term goddess being used here combines the character for god and female. In the context of this novel, it more specifically means daughter of a god. I'm using the common rendering goddess for a few reasons. First of all, using daughter of a god or goddaughter becomes very clunky. Second, I have not used goddess for any of the female god characters in the novel. All such female gods are simply just called gods. When this term comes up in future chapters, it will always retain the meaning daughter of a god. 2. The chaotic sea of spacetime was previously mentioned in chapter 1170. 3. There's an additional relevant line of text regarding the little butterfly in the next chapter, so I'll save my customary links to past chapters for then. Chapter 1227, Xu Qing's Fury. The wind in the revered ancient mainland carried a familiar humidity. It came from the depths of the Sea of Endlessness and from the mutagen that filled heaven and earth. It was very different from the 5th star ring. Upon sensing it, Xu Qing opened his mouth to speak. And yet, even though his lips quivered, no words came out. Everything around him seemed somewhat blurry. Perhaps it was the distortions caused by mutagen, or maybe just the general influence of the gods. The only thing that seemed clear was the decrepit old woman in black clothing standing next to him. The wrinkles on her face seemed like ravines etched by time, hewn out by wind and rain and fate. Of course, he remembered that little butterfly. Back then, she had been a young woman. There had been tension between the two of them until she took him to the Summer Immortal Palace for the first time. That was when he had met the old palace lord, who was, of course, human. 1. Despite all those memories existing in his head, Xu Qing felt like they weren't completely real. Master once said, the old woman continued, that people who have not experienced excruciating pain can never understand such a feeling. It's like they can't even believe it. They will even go so far as to trick themselves into believing that nothing ever happened. And that's because after excruciating pain is absolute nothingness. She smiled bitterly. I watched the catastrophe strike. I saw everything go away. That's when I understood what Master meant. After experiencing all of that, 1,000 years passed and I still haven't left this place. And now today I've run into you. I just hope that one day you can leave. The old woman turned bitterly and made her way off into the distance. She looked bleak, desolate, and infinitely lonely. Looking at her retreating figure, Xu Qing suddenly said, "What happened to my master? My eldest brother? Plumdark and Linger, and what about all my other friends? My fellow apprentices and everybody? What happened to them?" People who knew Xu Qing would hardly recognize his voice at that moment. It was as hoarse as the grating of infinite grains of sand. He hardly dared to ask the questions he had just asked. But he did ask them, his voice hoarse and trembling. The old woman stopped in place, her back to Xu Qing. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice seemed to contain the flow of history, like a reed flute echoing in time. 1,000 years ago, that ancient immortal came looking for something. He started with humankind. When he saw the statue of Grand Emperor Swordsage, he waved his hand, and most of humanity was wiped out. Empress Summer departure was strong. But to him, she was like a child. He erased her mind and turned her into a godslave. Your master didn't do anything at first. To him, humankind wasn't very important. He only cared about those people close to him. That ancient immortal left South Phoenix alone. There was karma between him and your master, so he carefully avoided it. But eventually, your master came out of seclusion. He stood up to the ancient immortal and tried to stop him. And that was because the thing sought by the ancient immortal was that eldest brother of yours. Your master fought for him. Your eldest brother eventually returned from brilliant heaven with a peak quasi-immortal cultivation base. But that wasn't enough to change anything. Your master died in the fight, and your eldest brother went mad. He became the sacrificial object the ancient immortal sought. In the end, your sect was wiped out. Your other elder brothers and your elder sister were not spared. South Phoenix sank into the sea of endlessness, and they all became corpses. After that, the ancient immortal left and brilliant heavens stirred. The gods therein awoke. Emperor Ancient Spirit took advantage of the opportunity to rise to prominence, and revered Ancient descended into chaos, too. I vaguely remember that Plumdark you mentioned. She ended up homeless and miserable, and eventually perished as fodder for the new gods. I also remember Linger. She was devoured by Emperor Ancient Spirit to get at the destiny aura she had. As for everyone else you knew, they died over the 1,000 years that have passed. Xu Qing bowed his head. The old woman didn't say anything further. That was how things ended for everyone Xu Qing knew. The wind blew from off in the distance, harsh and desolate. It kicked up the dust and lifted Xu Qing's hair, but it couldn't take away the infinite heaviness in his heart. That was how things ended for everyone he knew. The old woman sighed. As she disappeared into the wind, she said one more thing. If it weren't for that thing you left underneath, revered Ancient, I would have assumed you died out there. She quietly shook her head, and then, in all her lonely bleakness, she disappeared over the horizon. From the look of it, now that her master was gone, she had the responsibility of carrying on the mission of the Summer Immortal Palace. Unfortunately, she wasn't sure if there was any point to it anymore. But that was the dying wish of her master, and so she disappeared into the blurry world. Time passed. Xu Qing just stood there for a long time. He wasn't really sure how he felt. It was as if his thoughts had gone still. Everything had paused, even his soul. He listened to the sound of the wind. To him, it sounded like sobbing, even whimpering. Endless pain filled him, like the rushing of the tide, overwhelming. Everything started to turn as red as tears of blood filled his eyes. He opened his mouth to murmur something, but only blood spilled out. He staggered backward. So, when pain becomes excruciating enough, it turns into nothingness. He couldn't even weep. He had lost everything. His heart was a black hole that could devour all. Within that black hole was endless emptiness. Xu Qing felt like it should be familiar to him. It was similar to being in the chaotic sea of space-time, but he didn't want to think about that. Within his heart and mind, the old woman's parting words echoed over and over again. Her words became like sparks that started gathering in his eyes. Your eldest brother went mad. He became the sacrificial object the ancient immortal sought. I also remember Linger. She was devoured by Emperor Ancient Spirit to get at the destiny aura she had. Empress Summer Departure. He erased her mind and turned her into a god-slave. If it weren't for that thing you left underneath, revered ancient. The sparks raged. Xu Qing suddenly looked up. Maybe eldest brother didn't actually die. Maybe Linger made a clone of herself. There's also hope for Empress Summer Departure. Plumdark might have reincarnated. There are still paths to choose from. What's more, everything she told me was hearsay. It might not even be true. Xu Qing's eyes blazed as if with fire, and I did leave something behind. Xu Qing looked up, and his eyes seemed capable of piercing the deepest depths. His divine will spread out. He looked at all the ruins. He looked at the familiar yet unfamiliar world. He looked at the gods everywhere, and his heart cried out. His soul trembled. Eventually, he got a response, although it was so weak it seemed just on the verge of being extinguished. It was coming from the sea of endlessness. Xu Qing suddenly vanished. In the silt deep beneath the surface of the sea of endlessness, a host of sea snakes wriggled along. They pulsed with fluctuations of intense godliness, and if one examined the sea snakes closely, it was obvious that each one had a gruish ghost face on it. Deep within the silt was a dead body. Rather, it was half a body, as everything beneath the waist was gone. The upper half of the body was riddled with wounds. There wasn't much flesh left on it, and it really looked no different from a decaying corpse. Apparently, he had been sealed here, and despite being nothing more than a desiccated corpse, it was still possible to detect the fluctuations of god magic coming off of it. Because of that god magic, Hai's body was slowly reverting from a god state into that of a mortal. The process wasn't far from being completed. The sea snakes would occasionally come here to devour some of the flesh off the corpse. If things continued on like this, then it wouldn't be long before the dead body disappeared completely. But then, in the calm, dark depths of the seafloor, things stirred. It was as if space were being broken open. The mutagen in the area and the pressure of the sea depths were instantly wiped away. A figure stepped out of nowhere. It was none other than Xu Qing. As he walked along, all things on the seafloor trembled. Even gods went still. He reached the silt and the sea snakes. His gaze caused the sea snakes to shake violently. The silt seethed, and the buried body was revealed. Upon laying eyes on the corpse, Xu Qing's chest quivered. This corpse was his god clone. However, the soul inside of it was like a candle flickering in the wind, just on the verge of being extinguished. Xu Qing could see from the horrific injuries on the clone's body that the god clone had fought in the catastrophe. If I absorb this god body into myself, the fact that we're of the same origin means that I'll be able to experience what the clone experienced. I can verify everything. Heart pounding, Xu Qing neared the corpse and lifted his right hand to absorb it. However, just before he took action, he shivered. He looked more closely at the mangled body, a strange look in his eyes. This god body actually comes from the broken face. Its soul could be destroyed, but the flesh could not. Also, how could it be sealed here so easily with a god magic? Pupils constricting, Xu Qing suddenly looked up, out of the sea of endlessness and into the canopy of heaven. Up above, there was no broken face. Earlier, this hadn't seemed strange at all to Xu Qing. But then he thought back to everything he had experienced, including the encounter with the God Lord, and he realized he could only remember certain key details. He didn't remember everything that happened. Even right now, the revered ancient mainland was a blur. All those things were like reflections in a mirror. As Xu Qing came to that realization, he suddenly spoke. Aurora Immortal Palace, heaven beyond heaven, crush. Wild colors flashed in heaven and earth, the sea of endlessness filled with rumbling sounds. In the revered ancient mainland, lands shook and mountains were rocked. The entire world was quaking. Massive cracking sounds rang out. It was as if a heavenly palace were crushing down onto it from outside. Everything Xu Qing could see suddenly popped like a bubble. It became dust, roiling out in all directions. A starry sky replaced it. Starlight shone as the might of an immortal palace erupted. The illusion was erased, and the truth was revealed. The world changed dramatically. Xu Qing could see everything clearly. He wasn't in the revered ancient mainland. He was clearly in a heaven beyond heaven. There was a corpse in front of him, but it wasn't his god body. It was clearly a true god that was half person, half spider. The true god wanted Xu Qing to willingly fuse with him. In that manner, the true god could switch bodies and return by means of Xu Qing's husk. But Xu Qing had woken up. It resulted in an instant backlash for the true god, especially considering the immortal palace was crushing down and the heaven beyond heaven was bolstering Xu Qing. The true god's face distorted. Golden blood leaked out, and a cry of anguish echoed in all directions. "How did you wake up?" Xu Qing looked at him, flames of fury raging in his eyes as he looked at him. He had never been more furious in his entire life. 1. The butterfly started out as a young woman. She changed from a young woman into a butterfly when she and Xu Qing fought in Chapter 805. That was also when she took him to the Summer Immortal Palace. 2. Emperor Ancient Spirit was first mentioned in Chapter 430 and most recently in 1015. Chapter 12:28, Spacetime Amber. Xu Qing had spent his youth wandering in misery. He had experienced the suffering of the human world, and he had survived it all thanks to his tenacious desire to keep on living. Those experiences had made him cautious by nature. He would seek revenge over the smallest grievance and had learned how to coldly slaughter his enemies. It had also fueled his thirst for knowledge and had caused him to endlessly yearn for light and beauty. He was not the type of person who would casually open his heart to others. His life had experienced twists and turns, but overall, things had been better than they had been in his youth. Slowly but surely, he had opened up his heart. Unfortunately, though his path was like a blooming flower, it also came to be like a wilting flower. As he grew up, and as his heart opened, his world became filled with people. He was moved in the depths of his being. Also within him was a storm that could be called nothing other than fury. The first time he raged with fury was when Sergeant Thunder died. The next time was when Grandmaster Bai was murdered. It happened again when his own older brother had killed Master Sixth, and he had learned the truth about Peerless City. The fourth time was when Grand Emperor Swordsage perished. Today was the fifth time. Now that he was awake, he could see the many flaws in the illusion he had just experienced. But his feelings had been real. Now he knew what it was like to lose everyone he cared about. He had felt the pain, and he had felt the emptiness which followed. Now that he was awake, the intensity of his anger was equivalent to the intensity of the pain he had experienced. And now, he felt no need to respond to the words spoken by this true God who was still in the process of returning. His aura, his bloodshot eyes, and the intense fluctuations rolling off him became a pure killing intent that filled him, filled his immortal embryo, and filled the aura immortal palace. It erupted. The starry sky trembled. Ripples flowed through the heaven beyond heaven. In this starry sky, Xu Qing's immortal embryo was boundless. The Aurora Immortal Palace was clear within it, and all of that heaven-shaking, earth-shattering power was unleashed onto the half-person, half-spider god. Rumbling sounds echoed out that surpassed everything from before. Boundless immortal light shone from the immortal palace. As it fell, the returning true god tried to dodge. Unfortunately, he had not yet returned and was very weak. At the same time, the backlash from Hai's arts of godhood brought pain to Hai's soul. He could not hold back from screaming in anguish. The full weight of a heaven beyond heaven was not something that he, a weakened true god, could stand up to. Because of all those various factors, there was no possible way he could escape. The majestic immortal palace crushed down. The true god trembled under the force of the blow. He shrank down, golden blood spraying out. Cracks spread out across Hai's body, and pain swept through him like storm winds. He wanted to fight back, but Xu Qing's fury could not have been greater, and he would not give this god the chance to fight back. The light of the Aurora Immortal Palace flared again, shining into the starry sky and drawing even more power to launch another crushing blow. Rumbling sounds mixed with the scream of the true god. The true god's fleshly body was crumbling even more. The spider half of the body was almost completely pulverized and was leaking large amounts of ring source. He continued to struggle, trying to use the escaping ring source to fuel a god magic. But Xu Qing had very nearly died just now, so there was no way he would let his guard down. He took a step forward, entering the Aurora Immortal Palace, where he sat down cross-legged in the main hall. In the outside world, the Aurora Immortal Palace was an illusion, but in this heaven beyond heaven, it was true and real. Once seated inside, Xu Qing commanded full authority as the lord of this heaven beyond heaven. His cultivation base was insufficient, and he was not skilled enough to truly restrain a true god. But the immortal palace itself was the most deadly weapon he could wield. He needed no divine abilities. No Taoist magic could match the fury that raged in his heart right now. It was pure violence. In response to his very thoughts, the Aurora Immortal Palace once again smashed down onto the returning true god. Once, twice, 3 times. Xu Qing was venting his rage. Ear-shattering, rumbling sounds echoed out that drowned out the shrill screams of the true god. The god's body was full of cracks. And then, another anguished scream echoed out as the spider half of the body collapsed into fragments. Left behind was the person half of the body, whose gaze was extremely weak. However, pain in the fleshly body or the soul was not what this true god feared the most. What he feared was the black hole below. It was a prison formed by the power of this heaven beyond heaven. If he fell into that prison, then coming back again would be nearly impossible. As the immortal palace smashed down on him again and again, he got closer and closer to the black hole. At that critical juncture, Hai's eyes suddenly lit up. Golden fire erupted from within them, incinerating everything around him as it flowed over his body. Astonishingly, he was choosing to burn up his own body. He was self-destructing. Erasing the carrier would indicate that he had failed to return, but at the same time, it would wipe out all traces of him. And that meant that he might be able to return sometime in the future. But if the carrier body remained and was stuffed into the black hole, then he would have no such chance. Therefore, he didn't hesitate for a moment to try to incinerate his carrier. He even ignited the large portion of godhood that had returned. It didn't matter how heavy a price he paid if he could eventually return in the future. If there was one thing the gods didn't lack, it was time. He could keep waiting. He carried out the incineration with incredible decisiveness. It was so quick and violent that it seemed impossible to stop. In the blink of an eye, the flames raged to the extreme, and Hai's body became incredibly weak. Unfortunately, he had underestimated Xu Qing. As Xu Qing sat cross-legged in the immortal palace, glaring at the burning true god, the coldness in his eyes grew incredibly intense. He knew that true gods were undying. As such, he had not attacked with the goal of killing this god. Instead, he wanted the god to experience excruciating pain. And thus, it went without saying that he wasn't going to let the god escape. That was not the ending he wanted. Xu Qing lifted his hand and said, "Be sealed." The green heaven trembled. Countless stars, galaxies, and universes all responded to his control by means of the immortal palace. The entire heaven beyond heaven enacted a sealing. The heaven beyond heaven was completely cut off from the outside. He was making this heaven beyond heaven a gigantic prison. Of course, it was part of a higher star ring, and true gods were undying. The fact that as long as the true name existed, a true god could leave and come back was an expression of the love toward them shown by the higher star rings. They were like fish swimming in the sea, so this isolation wasn't complete. It was like a fish net that, though spread wide, still had holes in it. However, Xu Qing was not limited to this one method. All of a sudden, something flew out of the immortal palace and hovered in the starry sky outside. It was an hourglass. In the reflected history of the Aurora Immortal Palace, Xu Qing had acquired a space-time precious treasure. Contained within it was a 2-hour time period that transcended this space-time. It could add an additional 2 hours to any point in time, and whatever happened inside could not be erased. It would exist beyond space-time and beyond the timescape. It could not be limited by any other space-time. If someone who controlled space-time canon used it, then they could make that time flow normally, or more quickly or slowly. The limit was 2 hours. After the hourglass appeared, a cracking sound rang out. The hourglass broke open, and the sand inside shone with a 5-colored glow. As it spread, the burning true God, along with Hai's body and godhood, was covered by the sand. It added an additional 2 hours to him. It was a 2-hour period that did not have any karma, nor was it part of this space-time. Because Xu Qing controlled space-time canon, he could slow down the departure and the incineration by a significant amount. In that instant, the world suddenly had an additional 2 hours. If the closing of the heaven beyond heaven was like the casting of a fish net, then the space-time sand was a way to slow down the fleeing fish. It ensured that the god could not escape quickly, and it drew out the period in which he was weak. This development caused the starry sky to tremble, as the will of a true name echoed out with incredulity. Xu Qing stood up in the immortal palace. His eyes were extremely cold as he stepped out into the starry sky, where he appeared in front of the weak god, who was now experiencing one breath of time that lasted for 2 hours. "You like inflicting pain on others?" Xu Qing asked. It was the first time he had spoken during the fight, and his voice was as cold as ice. "Well, then you can enjoy it for a bit." Xu Qing waved his hand, and a coffin of ice appeared. It was a 9-colored coffin that pulsed with frigid energy. It was young Lord Aurora's ice coffin, which Xu Qing had taken from the Heliodoran imperial clan. Immortal Lord Aurora and his wife had prepared the coffin for their son, and had sealed him inside as an infant. The coffin would freeze the fleshly body and the soul, and also time. It was only natural that objects made by immortal lords were astounding. Xu Qing tossed the coffin toward the burning true god. Once the god was inside, he sealed the lid, which became solid ice. The true god, who was burning and not fully returned, was trapped inside. Time was also sealed inside. To a certain extent, it meant that the true god was stuck in a state of partial return. The god could not leave, nor could he return. It was like being stuck in space-time amber. From now on, the god would be stuck in burning pain that had no end. The undying nature of this true god was no longer a blessing to him from a higher star ring. It was a curse. At the same time, he would provide a constant flow of ring source. It was almost like he had become a spirit stone. Chapter 12, 29. The illusion contained reality. There was no door to life. There was no path to death. There was no way to depart. There was no means to return. Thus was the pain of this true god. He was frozen in an ice coffin, sealed in time by the space-time hourglass, Hai's karma ensnared by the heaven beyond heaven. Stuck halfway between returning and departing, he was like a special spirit stone that emanated ring source. All he could do was descend into the burning pain, Hai's soul torn apart as Hai's godhood, and ring source was slowly sucked away in what amounted to pure torment. Out in the starry sky, Xu Qing looked coldly at the ice coffin. His fury was finally subsiding. The end this true god had experienced was the best kind of torment to inflict on him. Since he enjoyed pain, he would personally feel a lot of it. It's too bad I don't have Yu Liuchen's godly authority of telling stories. If he had that godly authority, then he could draw out time even further. He could tell a story of pain upon pain for this true god, and ensure that his time spent sealed in ice was one of even greater mental torment. At the same time, he would be able to extract even stronger ring source. There's no rush. Xu Qing retracted his vision, then went over and sat down cross-legged on the ice coffin. Closing his eyes, he began doing some breathing exercises. All of his pores opened, and ring source from the coffin poured into him. The ring source was strong and pure, and as he did breathing exercises, it flowed into him. Once inside, it reached his immortal embryo and provided profound nourishment. The immortal embryo began to emit a soft glow that illuminated the surrounding darkness and caused the innumerable universes, galaxies, and planets in the heaven beyond heaven to be a bit brighter. They were still recovering. As light pulsed off Xu Qing's immortal embryo, the immortal palace that served as his immortal foundation reacted similarly. In that manner, time passed. A month went by. Xu Qing opened his eyes. A mysterious light shone therein as he looked down at the coffin floating in the starry sky. The coffin had originally emitted strong ring source, but it had diminished quite a bit and had gone from a raging river to a trickling stream. That was no surprise. The special spirit stone made of a god would last for a long time and would provide a lot of ring source. But it wasn't going to all come out at once. Absorbing it slowly but surely would be the most beneficial thing for Xu Qing. During his month of breathing exercises, he had made some significant cultivation progress. His immortal embryo had become more stable, and its aura and pressure had increased. The immortal palace that served as his immortal foundation, plus his status as the lord of this heaven beyond heaven, ensured that his aura was far closer to that of an immortal. He was now very close to the peak of early quasi-immortal. On the outside, cultivation speed like that would provoke instant jealousy among others. It was incredibly fast. After all, the quasi-immortal level was about the process of going from an immortal embryo to a mature immortal, and it required terrifying amounts of ring source. Becoming a mature immortal was the sign of the lower immortal level. Unfortunately, it was too slow for Xu Qing. I need more of these true god spirit stones. Licking his lips, he stood and looked off into the distance. He was thinking about what he had seen in that illusion. Now that I think about it, there were some very strange aspects to that illusion. His eyes glittered mysteriously. In the illusion, it had taken him 10 years of secluded cultivation to reach the peak of quasi-immortal. Although his memories didn't contain all the details of how that happened, he could clearly remember what it felt like to reach that level. There was something especially noteworthy. If I really did spend 10 years of secluded cultivation here, it's hard to say if the ring source coming from the ice coffin would be enough to reach the peak of quasi-immortal. But it would definitely be enough for late quasi-immortal. It seems safe to say that the illusion was at least logical on a theoretical level. Even as the thought occurred to him, his mind filled with a haze. On an instinctual level, he wasn't willing to take that route. He was not going to stick around here in seclusion. For one thing, he didn't want things to end up like they had in the illusion. What was more, sitting around in seclusion was the slow path to making progress. There was another reason. Xu Qing knew full well that if he wanted to break out of the quasi-immortal level and step into lower immortal, he needed more than just ring source to transform his immortal embryo. He needed to push his canon to a higher level. And I need my 10th extreme. He currently had no direction to pursue when it came to his 10th extreme. He hadn't even done that in the illusion. After some thought, he put the ice coffin into the black hole. The black hole would absorb the ring source and keep it stored for later use. Looking thoughtful, he turned to leave, but then he stopped in place all of a sudden. His eyes glittered. Wait, no. I must have made some progress with the 10th extreme in the illusion. After all, by the time I got back to Revered Ancient, my cultivation base was not quasi-immortal, but I can't remember the details. He frowned. Now he was more doubtful than ever about the illusion. Unfortunately, without more detailed information to go on, he had no choice but to suppress his doubt and leave the green heaven. Meanwhile, outside of the green heaven, the streams of immortal will began to disperse. Before leaving, they couldn't help but glance back incredulously at Xu Qing emerging from the green heaven. They would remember Xu Qing. It would be impossible to forget what they had just seen. The Lord of the Aurora, heaven beyond heaven, with a quasi-immortal cultivation base and battle prowess close to that of an immortal, had crushed a returning true god. A stunning achievement like that was enough to raise the eyebrows of them all. One by one, they left. The figure standing in the highest tower in the Nine Shores' immortal palace nodded. Since he seized the destined opportunity and accomplished his acquisitioner's mission, then there's not much point in him staying in this star ring. Send orders to the Department of Acquisitions, he said. The squadron of new ascendees will be converted to a transporter squadron. Just like all the other squadrons, they'll take what they collected as acquisitioners and transport it to the battlefield. They don't need to come back. They'll move in directly to the Star Ring's God Barrier Formation. In response to Immortal Lord Nineshore's words, the tower trembled, and then an official decree was sent from the Nineshore's heaven beyond heaven. Poison Monarch was in the Department of Acquisitions. As he sat there cross-legged, his eyes opened. New orders had come in from Immortal Lord Nineshores. He checked the orders, whereupon his expression flickered. After looking off into the distance, he sighed. Is the kid lucky, or is he unlucky? Poison Monarch didn't want to simply give in like this, but the orders were from Immortal Lord Nineshores, and he didn't dare to work against them. Sighing, he made the arrangements. Xu Qing left the green heaven and returned to the same spot in the heavenless zone. The prison was gone. However, the guards, the wardens, and Sir Star Ring and the Ascendees were all waiting to see how things ended. A month had passed, and they were all feeling uneasy. After all, it shouldn't have taken an entire month for a true god to return after the process had been started in the way it had. Therefore, when they saw Xu Qing, they relaxed a bit. That was especially true when they realized that he was obviously stronger than in the past. Zhou Jingli was the first to step forward and bow. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have crushed a true god. There is truly no end to your virtuous achievements. Everyone else rushed to pay respects. All of them were shaken to varying degrees. The Ascendees had personally witnessed Xu Qing becoming a quasi-immortal. They had sensed the majesty of his immortal embryo and the fact that he was lord of a heaven beyond heaven. Now he was very nearly as strong as an immortal. They had also watched him teleport a true god away and then calmly return. Even Top Chosen couldn't avoid being astonished to see him make such rapid progress and reach such great heights. Sir Star Ring looked quietly at Xu Qing and sighed in his heart. The difference between them was only growing larger. However, that feeling didn't last for long before it turned into a motivating force. Xu Qing looked around at everyone. Upon seeing that the wardens and guards were still present, he relaxed a bit. Things were already different from the illusion. After all, in the illusion, he had come out to find the warden and guards gone. But then, even as such thoughts entered his mind, and as everyone was bowing to him, something happened, before he could say a word. The Ascendees, identity medallions all vibrated. New orders came from the Nineshores' heaven beyond heaven, conveyed through the Department of Acquisitions. There are new developments in the war outside the Star Ring. There is a huge demand for ring source. All acquisitioner squadrons are to personally transport the ring source they have collected to the front lines as transporter squadrons. There shall be no delays. All of the Ascendees reacted with visible surprise. Transported ourselves to the front lines. Hordeslayer and Rampart were trembling with astonishment. Yuanshan Su frowned. Li Mengtu's expression flickered. Sir Vilespirit's pupils constricted. The Ascendees all reacted in different ways. The war had always been something far, far removed from them. None of them had ever imagined that they would see it so soon. That was especially true considering that their cultivation bases would make them like drops of water in the ocean. They could die at any moment. Maybe they would run into godfire gods or altar gods. They might even encounter true gods. Based on their previous understanding, the war with the Fourth Star Ring was being waged between god lords and immortal lords. It was a war between gods and immortals. It was a war between opposing sides. It was a war of complete extermination of species. Zhou Jingli looked gravely at Xu Qing. Sir Star Ring's heart sank as he did the same. All of the cultivators did the same. Xu Qing, meanwhile, felt somewhat dazed. He was yet again thinking about the illusion he had experienced thanks to that true god. In the illusion, he had gone to the front lines. The difference was that, in the illusion, it had happened 10 years later. In reality, it was happening a lot sooner. 10 years sooner. Why did it happen that way in the true god's illusion? Was it a coincidence? A dour look filled Xu Qing's eyes. Chapter 12:30. Mutagen infects all. Gods hate immortals. Each of the 36 higher star rings were like massive, independent star charts. The interior of every star ring was boundless. But viewed as a whole, the higher star rings were actually connected, and they made an even larger, irregularly shaped ring that would astonish anyone who could see it. In the middle of the gargantuan ring formed by the 36 higher star rings, there was a vast, black sea of mutagen. The enormity of it surpassed all other things. Its name was the Primeval Sea. It was a mysterious, unimaginable place. In the middle of it was a place that only god paragons could enter, and even then, they would do so with great caution. It had 36 main streams which led to the 36 star rings, and within each star ring there were even more tributaries, and they formed that which the cultivators and the gods called the outer seas. The war between the 4th and 5th star rings was being fought on the border between those two locations. It was a place that was part of the 5th star ring, but at the same time, part of the 4th star ring. Neither the gods nor the immortals were willing to back down, so the war had dragged on for years in a deadlock. Neither side could do much to the other, and for the most part they had held back from taking the fighting to the level of the god lords. But then a new god lord appeared in the 4th star ring. That god lord was deployed to the front lines, and the tide of battle instantly shifted. Immortal Lord Deepgloom had met his match for the first time in his life. The fighting reached a point where it surpassed the level of mere Taoist magics and god magics. The fight between the God Lord and the Immortal Lord was something that ordinary gods and immortals couldn't even see clearly. Even true gods and lower immortals couldn't fully comprehend a fight between a God Lord and an Immortal Lord. They could only vaguely sense what was happening. That was because the core of a battle on the level of God Lords and Immortal Lords came down to momentum. To the cultivators in the war, Immortal Lord Deepgloom provided the momentum. He surpassed the heavenly Taos and was part of the determination of the 5th star ring itself. His will was paramount on the battlefield. As he stood there, he represented the unique energy of immortal cultivators, which could drive away mutagen. If all of that mutagen were to be driven away and replaced by immortal energy, then the situation with the war would completely change. In fact, if the day came when the mutagen of the 4th star ring were to be driven out and replaced by immortal energy, then, without mutagen, without the aura of the gods, well, the gods would be like fish out of water. No matter how they struggled, they would basically end up the same as the gods in the 5th star ring. That was the line of research the 5th star ring had been pursuing in their hopes of subduing the gods. The aura of the gods was mutagen. It was poison to cultivators and could infect all things. Immortal energy was the aura of immortals. It was anathema to gods and could harm them without even touching them. That was the source of a powerful momentum. Of course, the God Lord was aware of that. So when the new God Lord arrived at the front lines, the result was boundless mutagen spreading everywhere. It overwhelmed everything, including the immortal energy. And thus, the war between the 4th and 5th star rings, viewed from the highest of levels, was a conflict between a God Lord and an Immortal Lord. It was a clash between mutagen and immortal energy, and both sides were trying to build up their own momentum. Even if the gods didn't follow the conventions of war and went on the offensive, it wouldn't change anything. In order to fundamentally do anything, they needed to affect the clash between mutagen and immortal energy. The mutagen in the 4th star ring was very strong, but so was the immortal energy in the 5th star ring. If either side tried to invade the other, they would become much weaker. And thus, they nibbled away at each other, each side trying to build up momentum to create a critical moment. Therefore, both gods and immortals in the Lord level were extremely important in the war. As lords, they could both consolidate and fight over momentum. Because no one else could understand a fight between a god lord and an immortal lord, all they saw was a swirling mass of immortal energy and mutagen. As for the cultivators, they were watching to see their immortal lord gain the upper hand. When that happened, the immortal energy would spread and drive away the mutagen. The moment that happened, they would rush out to plant special Dao flags from the 5th star ring. The Dao flags would mark an area as being occupied with immortal energy, and it would signify an expansion of 5th star ring territory. Then, orders would be given to advance into the territory of the gods to destroy their foundation. It was a snowball effect. As the more territory fell, the more momentum they built up. That, in turn, supported the immortal lord and shifted the tide of battle in his favor. However, the same thing happened on the side of the gods. When the god lord gained the upper hand, the cultivators were prevented from planting Dao flags. In fact, Dao flags could be destroyed, and mutagen would spread far and wide. The end result was that, viewed from high above, the field of battle was an interchange between black and white. The black was the mutagen. The white was the immortal energy. It was like a black and white ink painting that was constantly shifting and flowing back and forth. That was how war was waged between the gods and immortals. The war was about momentum. Every attack influenced the field of battle, and the two armies' actions influenced the battle between the lords. It was very intense. Deaths occurred constantly. That was just what happened when the strong clashed with the strong. In the rear echelon of a battlefield that was as wide as countless universes, over 100 squadrons from the Department of Acquisitions were arriving at a teleportation portal. One of them was the same squadron that had caused some trouble for Xu Qing, and the other ascendees back to the planet that was the home base of the Department of Acquisitions. Upon materializing, they looked around with very serious expressions. Then, under the cold gazes of the warriors guarding the teleportation portals, they hurried off into the distance. The Acquisitioners were now transporters, and their mission was to disperse through the battlefield and deliver ring source to the eastern theater of the war. There was a desperate need for ring source there. The light of teleportation faded away, and Xu Qing appeared with his squadron. An unfamiliar starry sky stretched out overhead, and the atmosphere was somber. The immortal energy was scarce, and it was even possible to see wisps of mutagen floating here and there. Many of the ascendees felt out of sorts. To most of them, war had been some distant thing. Though most of them had experienced a lot of fighting in their lives, virtually none of them had experience in war. They could even hear occasional booms coming from the front lines or indescribable roars coming from other universes. Chaotic fluctuations rolled through space, and there was a unique and sinister coldness that only death could bring. Most of the ascendees were in a daze. Instinctively, they looked around to take in their surroundings. However, before any of them could see much, a warrior cultivator on guard duty yelled at them. "You lot, hurry up and get on with your delivery." The voice boomed louder than thunder into the hearts and minds of the squadron. It contained a mountain-toppling, sea-draining force, like a tempest that could crush anything in its path. Everyone was visibly taken aback. It was the voice of a lower immortal. Xu Qing's pupils constricted. He was no stranger to war. Though he had never fought in a war this massive, he was naturally more prepared mentally for what war was like. He immediately flew off the teleportation portal. The other cultivators in the squadron followed. The closer they got to the battlefield, the more dangerous things would get, and by extension, the more they felt the need to stick together as a team. That was just how human nature worked. Xu Qing had the strongest battle prowess of them all, and his status was far above theirs. Sticking close to him was their greatest chance of surviving. As for Xu Qing, his heart was sinking. As he sped along, he looked off into the distance and took time to sense his surroundings. He was more sensitive to mutagen than the rest of them, and he could sense that the mutagen was getting stronger as they made their way forward. If they need ring source so badly, then why don't they send stronger people to deliver it? That would be much more efficient. Why send people as weak as us to the front lines? The more he thought about the situation, the less it made sense. And as he felt the mutagen getting stronger, his speculations went wild. After a while, he had a theory. Around the time that the theory coalesced in his mind, he heard a whistling sound behind him as Sir Star Ring, Zhou Jingli, Sir Vilespirit, Yuan Shensu, and everyone else caught up to him. Eyes narrowing, he looked at them. Sir Star Ring's expression was grim as he said, "Xu Qing, my canon senses are telling me that the order in this area is fractured. Everything is chaotic. Something isn't right." Sir Vilespirit licked his lips and added, "As all of you know, I'm different from the rest of you. My canon isn't the result of enlightenment. I have a special canon treasure, my broken sword. Well, whenever I'm about to run into a deadly crisis, it gets very excited. And right now, it's more excited than it's ever been." Zhou Jingli looked extremely serious. After Sir Star Ring and Sir Vilespirit were done talking, he lowered his voice and said, "Your Majesty, it doesn't make sense for us to be sent here. I have a theory. Is it possible that we—" He glanced around at everyone, "Our bait. It's not that our squadron is being targeted specifically. Rather, the Acquisitioner squads are being sent here with ring source to turn them all into bait." Everyone scowled. Xu Qing's eyes glittered. That was the exact same theory he had come up with. "Right now," he said, "we're in cultivator territory. If we're being thrown out as bait here, it implies—" He trailed off, only to have his sentence finished by Yuan Shensu. "It implies that something big is about to happen here," she said. "They want to lure out any gods that are hidden in this area, all to make sure things here are more stable after that event occurs." Chapter 1231, Weak but Strong. In response to Yuan Shensu's words, they all exchanged glances. Everyone had different opinions on the matter. But in the depths of his heart, Xu Qing knew one thing for certain. He had come here to the 5th star ring to find resources to grow stronger. Therefore, he had to abide by the rules of the 5th star ring. He had become an acquisitioner and then a transporter. And here he was on the front lines. He had to accomplish his mission. Of course, the more he understood about the battlefield, the easier it would be to accomplish his mission. And also, the easier it would be to defend himself. With that thought in mind, he said, "Everyone, keep your guard up. We're going to split into smaller squads and advance in a staggered formation. Be ready to back up other squads at any moment. Zhou Jingli, you handle the particulars." "Yes, sir," Zhou Jingli said. He knew the individual members of the squadron much better than Xu Qing, so it didn't take him long to split up the more than 80 people into 5 smaller squads. Then they split up into a staggered formation. He also arranged for about a dozen of the fastest and stealthiest cultivators to spread out both ahead and behind to keep the main group informed of any sudden developments. Sir Vilespirit and some of the others with canon treasures used those treasures to surround the group with a powerful concealing aura. At the same time, Xu Qing hoisted a banner that covered the group with an additional layer of concealment. In that way, they hoped to keep their passage as unnoticed as possible. With those arrangements made, they started moving forward. Their caution was rewarded as their journey went on. Half a month went by. During that period of travel, which included the use of teleportation portals, things went smoothly. Given the unknowns and the fact that they all felt something strange was going on, they took a more roundabout route toward their destination. Thanks to their efforts at staying concealed, they were able to travel smoothly and consistently. At a certain point along the way, Xu Qing spotted a Dao banner. They were behind the front lines of the Eastern Theater, which meant they were in cultivator territory. As a result, each universe had a Dao flag planted in it. In terms of appearance, they came in the form of a planet-sized altar, atop which was a silver war banner. The war banners were the Dao flags of the 5th star ring, and they emitted a constant stream of very pure immortal energy, as well as a mighty pressure that would cause all living beings to tremble. With a Dao flag in place, a given universe would have a constant supply of immortal energy. Mutagen wouldn't be able to affect that area, and all things related to gods would be suppressed. It went without saying that large numbers of cultivators always gathered around the Dao flags. Xu Qing and his squadron passed through over 100 universes, which meant that they saw the same number of Dao flags. Some were large, some were small, depending on the size of the area they affected. The Dao flags served another function. They ensured that the forces of the cultivator army could communicate quickly and effectively. As they continued on their journey, Zhou Jingli maintained communications, especially with other squadrons on missions similar to their own. Time continued to pass. Another half a month went by. As they advanced, Xu Qing and his squadron got passing glimpses of many universes. Eventually, they left the rear echelon of the Eastern Theater and entered the staging areas in the middle of cultivator territory. After they passed through the staging areas, which was made up of hundreds of universes, they would reach the front lines of the Eastern Theater. Unfortunately, once they entered the staging areas, Sir Vilespirit's broken sword started getting even more excited, and Xu Qing could tell that the mutagen levels were much higher than previously. As they proceeded along quietly, Zhou Jingli's expression suddenly flickered. "Your Majesty, one of the transporter squadrons I was in contact with disappeared. Either they got cut off from communication, or they ran into a deadly situation." The squadron members looked even more serious than before. Xu Qing's eyes narrowed. The bait is working, they hooked a fish. He didn't need to issue any special orders. All members of the squadron were even more careful after that. They made sure to mask their spirit power fluctuations, they kept proper distance between each other, and they made sure to make the most effective use of their concealment techniques. Every time they went through another teleportation, they made sure to exercise more caution. Occasionally, they would sense something strange and would avoid a teleportation portal. They didn't hesitate to take the long way around if it seemed safer. Of course, they all kept their cultivation bases rotating at peak levels. A month went by. Either they had been lucky up to this point, or all of their caution had paid off, and their concealments had not been penetrated. Everything went smoothly. Unfortunately, Zhou Jingli kept getting news about dangerous situations. The majority of the transporter squadrons had been ambushed by that point. Some squadrons never had a chance to send out distress messages and were simply wiped out. Some held on for long enough to ask for help before communication was cut off, making it impossible to determine what happened to them in the end. Regardless, it quickly became clear who was doing the ambushing. Naturally, it was gods. However, these were not gods from the front lines. Instead, they were spies who had somehow hidden themselves in the Eastern Theater. They had been so deeply hidden that, normally speaking, they would never have revealed themselves. But now they were taking the initiative to target the various transporter squadrons moving through the area. It was as if there was a huge spy network covering the entire Eastern Theater. Despite how cautious Xu Qing and his squadron were, after months of safe travel, they eventually ran into some gods. The first person to notice something unusual was Sir Vilespirit, who was scouting on the right flank. He was already a peak imperial sovereign and was very close to being a quasi-immortal. By relying on his broken sword, he was confident that he could fight a quasi-immortal. What was more, he had puppet arts to rely on. As a result, he never scouted alone. He had 2 puppets with him at all times. That made him a particularly reliable scout. As for his broken sword, it had a mysterious origin. Its karma was inextricably linked with Sir Vilespirit, so that when it suddenly got excited and he felt himself shaking, he didn't hesitate to fall back. The moment he did, the aura of a god ripped through the void. Gods appeared out of nowhere, unleashing a mountain-toppling, sea-draining tempest. Dense mutagen and godly might instantly raged forth. Although Sir Vilespirit's 2 puppets fell back with him, they also unleashed attacks at full power. Unfortunately, they couldn't deal with this many gods. The puppets shivered as they withered up and were destroyed. Sir Vilespirit coughed up 7 or 8 mouthfuls of blood. Relying on his broken sword, he managed to survive the initial attack by the gods. Pupils constricting, he continued to fall back, all while sending a message to Zhou Jingli. "I ran into some gods, 7 altar gods and 23 flawless gods." Mutagen roiled in his wake as he fled. Terrifying godly fluctuations swept toward him to overwhelm him. He was just on the verge of being overwhelmed. His eyes were bloodshot from the sensation of deadly crisis that filled him. Then someone blurred into position next to him, grabbed his shoulder, and threw him back. Just before the wave of mutagen and godly fluctuations were about to sweep over the newcomer, he threw his left hand out in front of him. Crush. That single word caused spacetime to rumble. Overlapping universes appeared, turning into a crushing bout of spacetime. It blocked the path of the mutagen. When the collision occurred, raging shock waves swept out in all directions. After, the new arrival stood there tall and straight, while the tempest of mutagen collapsed. Revealed in the spot where the tempest had collapsed were 30 gods, all of whom looked different, but all of whom were terrifying. Their eyes were all locked onto the person in front of. He had long hair, a black robe, and exquisite facial features. As he hovered there, his aura was immeasurably close to that of a lower immortal. That aura caused all of the flawless gods to shift nervously. The 7 altar gods' eyes glittered with golden light. At the same time, whistling sounds echoed out from behind Xu Qing. Chains of order swept out in all directions as Sir Star Ring arrived. Numerous huge trees soared through the starry sky as if an endless forest had arrived. Atop the tallest tree in the forest stood Yuanshan Su, her eyes cold. There was also a gigantic eye hovering in the starry sky, within which, seated cross-legged, was Zhou Jingli. At the same time, poison spread out, along with killing intent. The cannon of other ascendees joined the mix, creating a massive pressure. There was also an enormous kelp plant, whose gargantuan body spread out to lock down the entire area. It looked less like these gods carrying out an ambush, and more like Xu Qing and his squadron hunting gods. Moments later, the kelp began to shrink the perimeter. Inside, the ascendees unleashed trump cards. Sir Star Ring and the other top experts held back none of their power. As Horde Slayer and Rampart flew in as streams of sword energy, the gods were shaken to the core. What was especially gruish was the manifestation of Zhou Jingli's cannon, the huge eye. It seemed to be predicting the gods' every move, as well as all the details of their godly authority, and he was informing everyone about how to deal with them. The gods were astonished. But what shook them the most was Xu Qing. His bell was able to restrict all magics. His iron skewer killed any god it hit. The layers of spacetime in the area seemed to contain the will of the many heavens. After the time it takes an incense stick to burn, the kelp plant removed the perimeter. Xu Qing and the squadron continued on their way. All the gods that had ambushed them were nowhere to be seen, and close examination would reveal that the auras of the squadron members had all improved. They had powered up a bit. So, said Li Mengtu, licking his lips, it turns out living and healthy gods provide the most delicious ring source. Sir Vilespirit had already recovered from his injuries. There are a lot of unknowns, but if we stick out a bit, we could attract the attention of some more gods. Yuanshan Su looked thoughtful, while Horde Slayer and Rampart seemed itching to fight again. Sir Star Ring's face was completely expressionless. As for Zhou Jingli, he shook his head. We did well just now, thanks to His Majesty. My foresight is telling me that a true god is behind all of this. There are also multiple altar gods in the same group. If we run into a force like that. Li Mengtu said nothing. Xu Qing looked at them calmly. We continue on as before. We stay cautious and keep under cover. Let's go. 1232, lighting a blood-colored lantern. Thanks to Zhou Jingli, everyone gave up on the idea of turning the tables on the gods and using their status as bait to create their own ambushes. Ring source was good, but living was better. If they ended up being targeted by a true god and a host of altar gods, then they would definitely be killed. They had been fortunate on their journey so far. The best thing to do going forward was to stay cautious and remain hidden. And thus, Xu Qing and his squadron disappeared into the universe. In the Eastern Theater, there were quite a few more god squadrons similar to the ones Xu Qing had encountered. Apparently, Thay had been able to remain in hiding this long thanks to outside help. As a result, the cultivators had a very hard time identifying them, and if things had gone along as normal, there wouldn't have been any way to root them out easily. What was more, these gods had godhood, which was a new development. They were not ordinary gods. They had powerful godly authority, and that was evident from the results of their ambushes. The staging areas of the Eastern Theater were already descending into disorder. The cultivator army stationed there had no choice but to split up to suppress and contain the incidents. Before long, the staging areas in the Eastern Theater were in complete chaos. Within that chaos, and amidst the numerous universes in the Eastern Theater, there was one universe called the Grace Source Universe. It contained innumerable galaxies, and among those was an unremarkable little galaxy, within which was a very ordinary planet. The planet was yellow. Looking down at the planet from the starry sky, it was possible to see the Earth seething as a huge rift opened up on it. The rift grew wider and wider, and then it started to open up. It was an eye. Put precisely, this was no planet. It was actually the eye of a god, disguised as a planet, and now it was opening up. Within the golden pupil, it was possible to see an army of gods that numbered no fewer than 10,000. Perhaps they had been there all along, or perhaps they had used some special teleportation method to go there. Regardless of how, they were there now. Astonishingly, they included gods in the Godfire level, a large number of altar gods, many in the peak of that level. And serving as high commanders, there were 3 true gods. One of them had a fog obscuring Hai's facial features, but Hai's godly might cause the surrounding starry sky to ripple and distort. Another was covered from head to toe with fire and pulsed with an incomparably holy aura. The last was about the same size as a human. He was clad in black armor that included a helmet covering Hai's entire head. He seemed infinitely mysterious. As soon as the god army Thay commanded arrived, the entire battlefield changed. The war between the 4th and 5th star rings was a war of momentum. The scope of the war was like a black and white ink painting, and right now, the black was flowing and the white was seething. They were devouring each other while simultaneously pushing each other away. Previously, if one could look down on the Eastern Theater from above, it was full of the white that represented immortal energy. But right now, the conflict between the God Lord and the Immortal Lord, which no one could directly perceive, was changing. In one small area of the battlefield, the black god energy suddenly became very weak. The mutagen vanished, and the white immortal energy rushed into the area. Meanwhile, an area filled with the white immortal energy was suddenly driven away, to be replaced by the pitch black of mutagen. That area was, in the staging areas of the Eastern Theater. It was a dramatic change. Because of it, all of the staging areas in the Eastern Theater suddenly filled with mutagen. Countless cultivator armies were suddenly struck with mutagen, weakening their cultivation bases and infecting them severely. Godly energy surged, and mutagen went wild. All of the Tao flags planted in the universes of the staging areas began to rock back and forth wildly. Cracking sounds rang out. It seemed like the Tao flags would start crumbling at any moment. If they did, then it would mean that the cultivators had lost control of the area. And if the Eastern Theater suffered such a grievous loss, the armies on the front lines would be isolated. But the cultivator forces rallied. They went all out to protect the Tao flags, all in the hopes of buying time. The gods attacking the transporter squadrons no longer remained in hiding. They emerged into the open, taking advantage of the mutagen to release an intense tempest of godly might. And they all shot directly toward the nearest Tao flags. At the same time, in many universes, other entities similar to the yellow planet from earlier all opened their eyes to reveal armies of gods. Battle raged. It was impossible to say if the god armies had been lying in wait, or if they had taken advantage of the chaos to slip behind enemy lines unnoticed. From the large number of troops involved, the latter seemed like the most likely possibility. Regardless, from the way they were taking advantage of the situation, it seemed clear that the gods were the ones taking the initiative to attack. There was no way they could have attacked with such precision at the exact moment that there was a change in momentum between the God Lord and the Immortal Lord. The goal of the attack was obvious: to destroy the Tao flags in the universes of the Eastern Theater's staging areas and to turn the entire region into God territory. As the gods appeared everywhere in the staging areas of the Eastern Theater, there was a spot in the very middle, in a place called the Cloud-Watching Universe, where cultivator armies were arrayed in formation. Every single galaxy there contained a huge army. Every single planet had an army banner on it. The somber and desolate atmosphere grew stronger. This was the location in staging areas of the Eastern Theater where the High Commander banner flew. All military orders in the Eastern Theater came from this location. In the middle of that starry sky was an enormous immortal altar that shone with boundless immortal light, and at that spot, an enormous figure sat cross-legged. He was the highest-ranking High Commander, and he was none other than the 5th Star Ring's extremely famous immortal monarch Silent Tao. He was the second-in-command to Immortal Lord Deepgloom. His cultivation base was at the peak of Lower Immortal. He was an experienced killer, and was known to be the strongest expert among peak Lower Immortals. In the pursuit of his Tao, he had come very close to the Great Circle. As his eyes opened, they glittered with killing intent. "They took the bait," he murmured quietly. During this war, both gods and immortals had set up very complicated and wide-ranging plans. The squadrons weren't the only bait. The Tao flags, the cultivators guarding the Tao flags, the staging areas of the Eastern Theater, and even immortal monarch Silent Tao himself. They were all bait. The goal was to turn the Eastern Theater into a massive vortex of flesh and blood. Like a bright lantern on a dark night, it would grab the attention of the army of gods, and it would also be a cover to hide the true plan. A cultivator with a mysterious origin, an assassin, was heading to the front lines in the 4th Star Ring to secretly kill the commander of the gods' Eastern Army, a peak true god. "Let's see what happens first. Will you manage to isolate me here and kill me, or will my mysterious assassin take you out?" Silent Tao's eyes narrowed as he looked off into the distance. Who is that mysterious cultivator? Master picked him and trusts him, and he's strong enough to kill a true god. There aren't many people like that. Mutagen raged in the staging areas of the Eastern Theater. It was getting stronger and stronger. The transporter squadrons were shaken by all the developments. Of the more than 100 squadrons that had come, most had suffered casualties. Within the mutagen-filled starry sky, Xu Qing and his squadron all had very serious looks on their faces. "Sounding very grim," Zhou Jingli said. "Based on what I can tell, about 70% of the squadrons have been wiped out. Those who survived have moved in the direction of the nearest Tao flags. What's coming next is going to be a major offensive by the gods. That means we have a decision to make as well. Do we try to make it to the nearest Tao flag, or do we keep going?" Zhou Jingli looked at Xu Qing. He wasn't the only one. The other ascendees were all looking at Xu Qing. Xu Qing surveyed the surroundings quietly. The sudden development had been surprising even to him. Things in the starry sky had changed in an instant. The immortal energy was gone, and mutagen was everywhere. He actually felt somewhat stunned. Truth be told, he was used to being in places with a lot of mutagen. In fact, it felt familiar. It was very much like the revered ancient mainland. He knew that cultivators with powerful cultivation bases could resist mutagen for a time. But if they stayed in such an environment for too long, they would gradually be invaded by it. What was more, the cultivation base required replenishment after use. And when you absorbed the energy of heaven and earth, and it contained mutagen, then eventually you would show signs of mutation. Given all that, it seemed that searching for a Tao flag wasn't the best option. Besides, failure to find one could mean death, and he would have no control over that. As for continuing onward, getting out of the staging areas and to the front lines also came with a lot of unknowns. For one thing, he had no idea what they might encounter along the way. What was more, he didn't know how badly the front lines were infected with mutagen. There was also the possibility of getting lost. But at least there's a chance for survival amidst those unknowns, and I'll have some measure of control. If I stay here and really do find a Tao flag, then it will just mean getting stuck there. And that will be an even more passive position. After some consideration, his eyes shone with determination. His voice echoed out. I want to keep going. I want to reach the front lines of the Eastern Theater. But if the rest of you want to do something else, I won't stop you." With that, he started moving onward. Li Mengtu and Zhou Jingli followed immediately. Sir Vilespirit and Yuan Shensu hesitated briefly, during which time Sir Star Ring followed Xu Qing. Hordeslayer and Rampart gritted their teeth and did the same. Finally, Yuan Shensu joined them. Sir Vilespirit sighed inwardly and made the same choice. As for the other ascendees, the majority made the decision to continue with Xu Qing. Some of them chose not to. Over 80 people had been with Xu Qing during the journey. For the first time, they split up. 50 continued on, 30 went their own way. It was currently impossible to say which group made the right choice. Chapter 12:33, A New God Arrives. Fighting raged in all the universes in the staging areas of the Eastern Theater. God armies poured forth from various locations, like unstoppable blades surrounded by mutagen. Intense fighting broke out around the Dao flags in all the universes. In some universes, the altars atop which the flags stood were reduced to ashes in an instant. The Dao flags were contaminated by mutagen and crumbled into dust. The cultivator armies in those locations were very unlucky. Some experienced mutation, some were enslaved by the gods, and some just died horrible deaths. It was a brutal scene. However, in some universes, the altars stood strong. The Dao flags continued to emit immortal energy, and the defending cultivators stood against the gods. But a price was paid. The battlefield soon reeked of blood and gore. Taken in as a whole, the staging areas of the Eastern Theater were full of endless slaughter. The Central Army of the Eastern Theater arrived to provide backup. That army fought back and forth with the army of the gods. They were like dogs snapping at each other. Casualties were inflicted on both sides. Death dirges rang out constantly. The Eastern Theater had turned into a brutal, blood-soaked grindstone. As the grindstone turned, gods and cultivators alike were sucked in, their bones crushed, their flesh pulverized, their souls eradicated. Blood oozed out, and thus everything became stained with red. Eventually, it was like a blood-red lantern flickering on the battlefield between the 4th and 5th star ring. Gradually, it attracted some attention. However, it was only a dimly flickering light, not enough to attract a lot of attention. The light needed to be brighter. The smell of blood and gore needed to be stronger. More god armies arrived. More cultivator troops showed up. Each side had different goals, but all of it served to make the fighting in the Eastern Theater grow more intense. There was no respect for life in war. There were only ideals and viewpoints that motivated each side to fight and kill. To the gods, these cultivators were lower beings insulting their superiors. They were trying to overthrow the rule of the gods. If it had been something far, far away, they might have ignored it. But the 4th star ring was simply too close to the 5th star ring, and the 6th star ring was special. What was more, there was a new god lord, and that meant they needed sacrifices. Because of that, the gods in the 4th star ring had to wage war. In contrast, the cultivators didn't think of themselves as lower beings insulting their superiors. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting to escape slavery. As humans, they were inherently strong-willed. Once they stood up, they would be unyielding. They would never bow down again. And thus, the slaughter grew increasingly intense. Because of the slaughter and fighting, time flowed a bit differently in the starry sky. Normally speaking, one's frame of reference related to the planets and universes. Oftentimes, it would take days just to notice a change in the position of such heavenly bodies. In times when there was no war, traveling in the starry sky often seemed very slow-paced, as nothing around you moved. But with a war raging and danger everywhere, it broke that illusion of stillness. Zhou Jingli's hard work was paying off. His foresight didn't just relate to matters of life or death. It related to heavenly bodies as well. "This universe is dying," Zhou Jingli said grimly. Sir Star Ring's expression was grave. His order and balance, as well as the heavens principle that he had acquired in the Heliodora universe, were all aspects of natural law. As a result, he could sense the same thing even more intensely. Order is unraveling. Chaos is increasing. Xu Qing, and the other 50 ascendees, felt overwhelmed with danger. "I can smell the blood," Sir Vilespirit said. "There's a massacre going on." Thanks to his broken sword, he was very sensitive to auras of death. Everyone else instinctively looked at Xu Qing. Xu Qing's eyes glittered. He could never have predicted that someone like himself would end up surpassing everyone else here. After all, Sir Star Ring understood order far better than him. But he was sensitive to mutagen. After all, he had dealt with mutagen from a young age. Besides, Starfear viewed mutagen the way that cultivators viewed spirit energy. After taking a moment to assess the situation with his senses, Xu Qing said, "The mutagen here is unusually strong. The life is proliferating dramatically." He offered no further explanations. He just sped on his way. Everyone else looked at him, their expressions more somber than ever. Though he had not offered a detailed explanation, he had made things clear. The stronger the mutagen got, the more Dao flags had been destroyed. For life to be proliferating indicated that more and more gods were arriving. They really had only one option now. They had to get out of the staging areas. That was what everyone was thinking. The situation was so dangerous and serious that everyone was more determined than ever about what to do. And thus, they sped up. Staying hidden and cautious, they continued toward the border between the staging areas and the front lines of the Eastern Theater. They ran into a few obstacles, but Xu Qing was like a sharp blade that could cut through anything they faced. Some people sustained injuries, but they were always able to continue onward at top speed. Maybe they were lucky, or maybe the gods were so focused on the Dao flags that they didn't bother to place many forces in the periphery of the action. Regardless, Xu Qing led everyone onward safely. Unfortunately, they didn't stay lucky forever. When they were very close to the border of the staging areas, only about 3 universes away from the front lines, they ran into something that completely halted their forward progress. It was a squadron of gods about 200 strong. There were many in the Godfire level, as well as altar gods. In leadership positions were 2 peak altar gods. Originally, Thay had not been targeting Xu Qing and his people. Their original mission had been to serve as support troops. Thay were simply passing through to serve as reinforcements for an army besieging a Dao flag to boost their morale. But when the 2 altar gods noticed fluctuations in the surrounding mutagen, Thay didn't hesitate to take advantage of the situation. Did a transporter squad really make it this far? The 2 peak altar gods were actually the same species. They were violet black from head to toe, with 6 arms and a fiery, diamond-shaped scale on their foreheads. As those scales glittered, the 2 peak altar gods turned expressionlessly to look in the same direction. There must be something unusual about these cultivators. They shouldn't have made it to this point. The 2 of them sent out messages of divine will, and their squadron changed directions to head towards Xu Qing and his people. Meanwhile, Xu Qing's pupils constricted as he sensed the mutagen stirring. Sir Star Ring, Zhou Jingli, Sir Vilespirit, and the others all sensed the same thing shortly after. Some gods have locked onto us. There's an intense killing intent approaching. The starry sky has been sealed. As everyone reacted with varying degrees of shock, Xu Qing said, "Everyone speed up." Acting on pure instinct, Xu Qing shot forward with greater speed. Everyone used different ways of following along. Unfortunately, the surrounding mutagen was going wild, almost like an explosive storm that prevented them from escaping. The unique chanting of the gods filled the area. Their minds blurred, their flesh distorted, and their perceptions were overturned. They were all affected to varying degrees. Xu Qing threw his hand up. Eyes filling with determination, he called out to Starfire, "I need to borrow your clay fox god form." Starfire could tell that it was a moment of crisis, and didn't hesitate to open her mind and let Xu Qing's divine will in. Xu Qing currently had a pure immortal body, but he also had a god clone. He just hadn't brought it to the 5th star ring. But before leaving, he had gained enlightenment of a number of godly authorities. That included the godly authority of sound, the godly authority of blood, as well as his godly poison curse. And there was the godly authority of good luck, not to mention others. The end result was that Xu Qing was not unfamiliar with gods and their godly magics. In fact, he was extremely familiar with them. The only difference was that his current body wasn't suitable for such things. He needed a medium to be able to control mutagen. But things were different with Starfire's body. That body could be a medium. With that body, Xu Qing could control mutagen. In terms of god magics, he could imitate them perfectly using Xeno-Immortal school techniques. All in all, he wouldn't be imitating someone else's techniques. He would be imitating the magics of his own god body, with which he was extremely familiar. 1. As for what happened next, Xu Qing's eyes glazed with an aggressive light as he stretched his hand out. It was a god technique that Xu Qing had not unleashed in the 5th star ring, but now he was going all out. The mutagen in the area surged as it became part of Xu Qing's will. All sound in the area, including the chanting of the gods, ceased. He had seized sound as part of his god magic. Turning it around, he sent the voice of the gods back toward the gods in deadly fashion. There was more. The mutagen in the area transformed, causing the blood of the gods to seethe. The gods that were chasing them suddenly found their god blood going wild. There was also a godly curse. It was a poison that struck with mountain-toppling, sea-draining force. It was as if a new god had arrived in the world. 1. I bet you thought the author forgot about the Xeno-Immortal school, didn't you? Or maybe you forgot. Well, the last mention of Xeno-Immortal stuff was in Chapter 1042, and it was first mentioned in Chapter 768. Chapter 1234, The Dual Brilliance of an Immortal and a God. All gods had their own personal mutagen ready to release at any time. Mutagen was the manifestation of the aura of a god. And right now, the mutagen filling the staging areas of the Eastern Theater came from the aloof gods and spirits, as well as all the other gods in the area. And in the god, Lord's attempt to create a sense of unity among the various gods, he had removed Hai's will from Hai's mutagen, which allowed it to commingle perfectly with the mutagen of the other gods. The result was that, as the gods descended on the starry sky, their mutagen worked together to create a shocking godly might. But if those gods could do that, then Xu Qing could do the same with Starfire's clay fox body. As the 2 altar gods and their host of nearly 200 god subordinates closed in on Xu Qing and his followers, his godly authority erupted. The might of the godly authority had Starfire as the basis, but was drawn out by Xu Qing's will. Back when Xu Qing used his god magics, he had been limited to the constraints of the Godfear level. But Starfire was an altar god now. Combined with Xu Qing's control using the Xeno-Immortal school techniques, his god magics were now on the level of an altar god. Rumbling sounds swept forth into the hearts and souls of the advancing gods. It became Xu Qing's godly voice. Halt! The moment that word echoed out, the approaching gods' expressions flickered. Only gods could hear that godly voice. Any cultivator who listened to it wouldn't understand it. All they would hear was a chanting that would fill their bodies and souls with terror. As Xu Qing spoke in his godly voice, the god blood inside of the gods seethed. Those in the Godfear level trembled. The altar gods immediately called on their own godly authority to suppress the effects. The gods immediately understood the karma at play. But there was more. The mutagen around them went wild as a vicious god curse was unleashed. Many of the gods felt sudden sensations of intense crisis. They knew that this entire situation could mean only one thing, and that was there was a terrifying altar god here. However, Thay didn't know who this altar god was. All Thay could be certain of was that it wasn't fake. This was a pure godly voice and true godly authority. What was more, they were full of extraordinary godly might. The approaching gods slowed down, and the 2 peak altar gods' eyes glittered. Thay didn't hesitate to unleash their own godly might into the area. It quickly made contact with the unfamiliar altar god up ahead, allowing them to assess the mutagen at hand. Thay quickly understood the situation. And then the godly voice spoke again. "These humans are my prisoners of war." many of the approaching gods chose to stop in place and advance no further. There were rules in place in the army of the gods. For instance, prisoners of war were considered private property. It didn't matter how many you took, they were yours. The two peak altar gods stopped in place. After all, they were on a reinforcement mission, not a mission to seize resources. If these humans hadn't already been taken prisoner, they would obviously attack them. But if they had been taken prisoner by another god already, that was a different story. That said, ever since this war with the fifth star ring began, it had become more common for them to encounter situations in which gods had been enslaved. It was always possible that this group of cultivators had done that. Although it would be hard to control a god this perfectly, one of the peak altar gods nevertheless stepped through the void to perform a closer inspection. When Xu Qing sensed the resulting fluctuations in the mutagen, he sighed inside. That said, it wasn't too much of a surprise. Borrowing Starfare's clay fox form to unleash godly authority to hoodwink these gods had been a gamble. So he had been prepared for failure from the beginning. As the altar god approached through the void, Xu Qing's eyes glittered coldly. Having made a decision, he shouted, "Attack!" Without any hesitation, he fully unleashed all of the godly authority he had sent out. Just to make sure it was as deadly as possible, he didn't target the two peak altar gods. Instead, he aimed for their subordinates, the godfire gods and weaker altar gods. The moment the peak altar gods began to move, the mutagen in the void thrummed. The chanting of the gods from earlier, as well as Xu Qing's godly voice, and even the sound of the blood flowing within the gods, and the imperceptible noise of their cultivation bases, was seized by Xu Qing. As of that moment, Xu Qing was the lord of all sound. Everything went silent, and then a sound like thunder echoed out. It was a godly voice like a tempest, and it was directed straight at the godfire gods and the altar gods. All such gods trembled. Their blood then flowed in reverse, as if it wished to explode out of. Next, the taboo poison curse erupted along with the roiling mutagen, melting everything it touched. That poison could strike fear into the hearts of cultivators, and it could shake gods as well. At the same time, the void shattered as a huge rift was ripped open. The kelp plant shot out, heading directly toward the large group of gods. Next came chains of order as Sir Star Ring emerged, pulsing with killing intent. Then came huge mountains, immensely heavy. Yuan Shensu stood atop the biggest of the mountains, 1. After breaking through to quasi-immortal, Zhou Jingli's cannon manifested as an enormous eye, and he also appeared, shaking the souls of the gods. Li Mengtu unleashed his poison. Sir Vilespirit went all out. He was blood-red from head to toe as he unleashed slaughter with his broken sword, becoming a streak of red that shot with deadly force toward the gods. In addition to all that, the remaining ascendees from Xu Qing's squadron, knowing how deadly the situation was, unleashed all sorts of trump cards. In the blink of an eye, the void filled with booms and shock waves. Bloody fighting raged. Of course, the two peak altar gods didn't react with any emotional fluctuations at all. They looked coldly at everything playing out, including the cultivators and their own subordinate gods. They didn't react visibly in any way. It was almost as if the deaths here were inconsequential to them, to the point of being uninteresting. But what did excite them was the rift that had been torn open. From inside of it emerged Xu Qing, striding step by step out into the open. He pulsed with the powerful aura of a god, causing godly projections to appear around him. Streams of godly authority flickered around him, manifesting a pure godly aura. But at the same time, immortal fluctuations rolled out from him. His immortal embryo formed, gigantic and pulsing with the pure will of a cultivator. He was manifesting the traits of both gods and immortals, all at the same time. He emerged from the rift to hover in the void. The gazes of the two peak altar gods instantly locked onto him. Then their eyes shone with golden glows, as if they could see Xu Qing inside and out. So, you enslaved a post-heaven altar god, allowing you to manifest godfolk authority. That said, godly authority this pure is rare indeed. I've heard that a lot of lesser species have tried to explore the Tao of gods. But your godly authority is different. Just like us godfolk, you have the blessing of a higher star ring. Don't tell me you were once a god. One look makes it all clear. The two gods spoke in very emotionless tones. They didn't seem moved at all. They couldn't have been more apathetic. This conformed to exactly what Xu Qing would expect of Preheaven gods. Given his various dealings with all sorts of gods, he knew how gods could do this. It was omniscience. He was right the moment he stepped out. The peak altar gods' eyes glowed golden, which meant that they had activated their omniscience. And they weren't just assessing his state, they were also attempting to see his past. They wanted to see his origin. And that was exactly what Xu Qing had been waiting for. That was exactly why he had walked out as a mixture of immortal and god. One quick reminder that Yuan Shensu's surname literally means distant mountain, S. Chapter 12:35, Executing Gods. The power of omniscience from the two peak altar gods flowed forth with their godly might. It came with a nearly paramount pressure, which turned into an almost corporeal light that spread out over Xu Qing. Godly might was erupting. Omniscience was being unleashed. Xu Qing shivered. He felt like he was transparent both outside and inside. That included his fleshly body, his immortal embryo, his soul. Nothing could be hidden, not even his past. Chaotic fighting raged in the area, but he was separated from all that. Everything slowed down, as if the operations of the world, the movement of the starry sky, and everything else was moving in slow motion. And the two peak altar gods, omniscience was slowly peeling through everything related to Xu Qing, layer by layer. They were peeling away the shell of reality and rifling through thoughts of the past. They were thoroughly observing Xu Qing. If they succeeded, then they would know everything about Xu Qing, and that would indicate that Xu Qing would have no power to fight back against them. That was how the omniscience of the gods worked. What was more, because this was coming from two peak altar gods working together, it would be incredibly difficult for Xu Qing to resist. And so, they succeeded in seeing Xu Qing's history. By means of Xu Qing's transparent body and soul, they saw the revered ancient mainland. On that unfamiliar landmass, they saw cultivators and gods, and they traced the origin back to Sealing County and the subterranean palace complex there. That was where they sensed the Phoenix Temple, and a figure seated cross-legged in front of it, pulsing with an eternal will. It was a god that looked like Xu Qing in every respect. This is the origin. The two peak altar gods looked thoughtful as they hovered on the battlefield. At the same time, they suddenly sensed some unknowable danger. There's something wrong about this god. The altar gods' hearts started to race as they realized that the growing sense of danger came from that unfamiliar continent, and that unfamiliar star ring, and that unfamiliar god. That was especially true considering that, behind this god, they saw darkness and gloom. Endless, never-ending darkness and gloom. It was that darkness and gloom that caused the sensation of danger in them to grow stronger and stronger. And that was because their omniscience was telling them that the darkness and gloom was taboo. It was instinctual. And because of that, they gave up further inquiry and prepared to retract their omniscience. Unfortunately, that was when the cross-legged god's eyes snapped open. Golden light spilled out. Then a godly voice spoke, as if using fate itself, right into the minds of the two altar gods' god souls. Since you're looking at this origin, you might as well look closely. Gods were omniscient, but omniscience was relative. To some extent, that was actually the higher star ring's way of protecting the gods. It made sure that they weren't invaded by entities stronger than them. After all, superior entities weren't subject to the omniscience of a god. They could not be sensed or perceived. When gods looked at such things, it was akin to a mortal looking into a dark room. It wouldn't be possible to see anything within the pitch black. Only people who actually lived in the darkness and were part of it would be able to see such things. For instance, the living things in the revered ancient mainland who could simply look up into the sky. Outside gods, however, would have no way to see or sense any such things. There could be no karma for them to root out. Theoretically speaking, even when these two altar gods locked down onto Xu Qing with their omniscience and looked into his past and his origin, they should have seen his god body, but not the origin. The reason was that they should have been protected from the origin in question. They should have seen only darkness. But someone illuminated the darkness. The moment Xu Qing's god clone spoke, the godly authority of fate swelled, and the tattoo on the clone's back shone brightly. It was a tattoo of a candle, and the candle had just lit up. The light of the flame flashed, instantly becoming a sea of light around Xu Qing's god clone. As a result, it illuminated everything around it, lighting up the darkness, as well as the omniscience of the altar gods. It forced them to see everything. It forced them to look deeper into Xu Qing. It forced them to witness his origin. It was as Xu Qing had just said. Since you're looking at this origin, you might as well look closely. The minds of the two peak altar gods reeled. Their god souls trembled as if immense weight were crushing down onto them, all as an infinitely paramount broken face appeared within their omniscience. It was as if it had bypassed their defenses and forced them to violate a very strict taboo. Their omniscience had shown them a higher being. It didn't matter that the higher entity's eyes were closed. The mere godly might emanating off the entity surpassed anything they had ever encountered in their lives. Anguished howls erupted from the depths of their god souls. That's. Their god bodies writhed. Their god souls convulsed. Their godly authority melted, and the two peak altar gods were filled with unending terror and astonishment. They went mad. On the most instinctual level, they would pay any price possible to escape. They would even burn their own bodies and sever the wills that attached them to this place. And that was because they could tell that they must not stay in this place under any circumstances, and they must not be there when this broken face's eyes opened. But then the broken face's eyelashes twitched, as if those eyes were about to open. That only caused these two altar gods to descend further into madness. They immediately took steps to destroy their own godly authority and damage their god souls to get away. But just as they were about to sever the threads of will, golden light shone from the forehead of Xu Qing's god clone, and a golden carving knife emerged. It was a carving knife that contained fate. The moment it appeared, it slashed toward the thread of will that was breaking apart the most quickly. It looked like it would slash the thread in two, but when it made contact, it actually bolstered it. Fate blessed that will, and from its countless futures, it carved out an ending of death. And thus, the will that had been about to break actually became stronger. It didn't break. The connection grew stronger until that god couldn't leave. "You!" the god shrieked in terror. At exactly the same moment, the other altar gods will actually did break, and the god vanished. Only one stream of will was left behind, and what awaited that god was the broken face hanging high in the dome of heaven over revered ancient. The face's eyes opened. Outside the Phoenix Palace, Xu Qing's god clone bowed his head and murmured, "Amen." The will that had been left behind howled in agony, fury, and madness. It tried to reach Xu Qing, but before that could happen, the god became a stream of golden light. A stream of unstoppable gravitational force latched onto it, and it was dragged up to the mouth of the broken face. The broken face's eyes closed. Xu Qing's god clone looked up. "Sadly, I was only strong enough to stop one of them." T small caph e sourk of THS content, S no, letter 1D20L fire, NT. Back on the remote edges of the fifth star ring, in the staging areas of the Eastern Theater, near the front lines, a scream filled the starry sky. The gods all looked over at a scene that shook their god souls to the core. Both of the two peak altar gods were glowing with golden light, but then one of them went completely and utterly dark. And then, the god disappeared as if being erased from existence. It wasn't just the god's body that disappeared. It was also the soul, the will, and all memories of that god. The god's past, present, and future disappeared, along with all traces of existence. The cultivators from the fifth star ring who had seen that god, as well as the gods from the fourth star ring, suddenly had no memory of him. That was true death. The gods and ascendees who had seen that altar god with their own eyes suddenly forgot. The remaining altar god's golden light flickered between light and dark. Hai's eyes turned gray, and he suddenly turned to flee. He wanted to escape this place immediately. He didn't remember Hai's companion, nor what he had seen in Hai's omniscience. But the feeling of death that overwhelmed him caused him to unhesitatingly flee. Of course, Xu Qing remembered. As he hovered in the starry sky, his eyes flickering coldly, he said, "Execute them." That was a signal based on the plan they had put in place. Upon hearing it, the Ascendees' killing intent skyrocketed. The vast majority of them went all out to kill the surrounding gods. The kelp plant emerged in full. 10 huge leaves spread out like barriers, splitting the area into 2 sections. On the inside was the peak altar god. On the outside were all the other gods. The kelp's mission was to buy time for the Ascendees on the outside to kill the other gods. Meanwhile, on the inside, Yuan Shensu's eyes glittered coldly. The endless mountains around her unleashed unrivaled weight, which crushed down onto the fleeing altar god, stopping him from fleeing. Zhou Jingli was there too. The eye formed from his cannon was bloodshot as it emitted soul-crushing weight, a gaze that could cut off the path of all souls. Next was Sir Starring, whose countless chains of order swept out as he unleashed heaven's principle on the altar god. This was the might of judgment. Sir Vilespirit's eyes were bloodshot, and his killing intent was at the pinnacle. He was under the control of the broken sword now, and he pulsed with avarice and madness as he streaked toward the altar god in a red blur. And Xu Qing used Starfare's clay fox form to unleash godly authority. Taboo poison, authority of sound, blood authority. The godly authorities complemented the Ascendees perfectly as they attacked. At that critical moment, the peak altar god acted on instinct alone to throw out god magics. Unfortunately, he had paid a heavy price to retreat from within Hai's own omniscience and was badly injured. Next, killing intent erupted. The tolling of a bell erupted from Xu Qing. As it thrust everything into silence, a black iron skewer emerged. Within that deathly silence, Xu Qing called on the power of his immortal embryo, the might of the immortal palace, and the trump cards of the other cultivators to form peak strength. The skewer shot forward. It was a single blow that could execute a god. It ripped through the void, ripped through space-time, and ripped through everything. It shot right up to the peak altar god and stabbed right into Hai's forehead. Chapter 1236, a Quisitioner squad reporting for duty. The starry sky shook. The kelp plant was pushing itself to the limit. But even with the kelp's help, the dozens of Ascendees weren't a match for so many gods. The fighting simply wasn't even. When Xu Qing and the other top Ascendees made their move, the kelp plant could just work hard to buy time. It didn't take long for the kelp's ceiling barrier to start breaking down. The huge leaves were battered away. The Ascendees, despite giving it their all, were so badly wounded they had to fall back. The isolated area opened up, and the gods who had been temporarily blocked outside were able to rush inside. Except, as the gods entered one by one, they were shocked to the core. They had already forgotten that they previously had 2 peak altar gods as their leaders. In their minds, they only had a single leader. But that leader was in horrible condition. Hai's skin was covered with a gruish tattoo that looked like a host of mountain peaks. Those distant mountains contained an incredibly heavy cannon that sealed the enemy with the power of 10,000 mountains. He was also wrapped up with a host of chains, each of which glittered with the light of order and emanated the might of heaven's principle. Every moment that passed, the chains pulsed with the power of judgment. Hai's chest was a mangled mass, out of which grew a huge eye. The evil, bloodshot eye was the manifestation of Zhou Jingli's cannon, which suppressed the god soul and cut off all avenues of escape. On the god's back was a bright red flower that was the manifestation of Li Mengtu's cannon. Furthermore, buried in the location of his heart was a broken sword. In fact, the sword pierced right through the altar god's heart, where it pulsed with avarice and madness. There was also a taboo poison curse, manifested as streams of black smoke that covered the god. invading him and inflicting excruciating pain. Beyond all that, an endless voice reached their ears and echoed into their minds, rising and falling with sounds of torment. All of the blood in Hai's body was flowing backward, causing the god to slowly wither in on himself. But most importantly of all was the fact that an iron skewer had stabbed into Hai's forehead. Xu Qing had 2 iron skewers. He had left one behind in the revered ancient mainland, with Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior as the spiritual soul, to stand guard over Plumdark. The other had been forged by the apprentice of immortal Lord Nineshores in the 5th star ring. It contained Xu Qing's personal canon, so it could enter overlapping universes and form resonances with multiple spacetimes. It also had a mode of heaven's principle, and given all that, the iron skewer's personhood was extremely high. It also had immense weight. It was a weight that even quasi-immortals would have to fear and respect. It could well be said that his second iron skewer was a precious treasure of canon, and the most powerful weapon Xu Qing currently controlled. Its infinite timelessness was something no one could tamper with. When it stabbed into this altar god, it sealed space-time, cutting him off beyond the timescape. He was not in the current time. He was completely and utterly suppressed. After the iron skewer stabbed into the god, it glittered brightly. And then, in front of all the other gods, the peak altar god simply disappeared. He was imprisoned in infinite timelessness. The gods were astonished beyond belief. After a brief moment of shocked silence, Xu Qing and the others, killing intent, raged out across the battlefield again. This had been the plan all along. First, deal with the altar gods, then go on a rampage. One couldn't afford blunders when fighting the gods. It was fine to shrink from a fight with them, but if you chose to do battle, you needed to kill them. You had to go all out. That was especially true in a case like this one. After all, even though Xu Qing and the other top experts had dealt with the peak altar gods, the enemy still had a huge advantage. They still had a desperate fight ahead of them. Preheaven gods had no emotions, but they did have an instinctual desire to remain alive. That obsession to live meant that they would do anything to avoid death. To truly resolve this crisis, they had to kill these cultivators despite their instinctual desire to avoid death. In the blink of an eye, intense fighting broke out in the starry sky. Blood sprayed everywhere. The blood of gods and the blood of cultivators intermixed and flowed. The stench of gore filled the void. Slaughter turned the area into a living hell. Screams of mourning, howls of rage, cries of anguish, the sound of clashing magical techniques, divine abilities, and god magics. The mixture of canon and godly authority, such things all mixed together. Mad killing took place. Li Mengtu and Yuan Shensu were splattered with blood from severe injuries. They were nearly spent. That was especially true of Yuan Shensu, whose face was ashen. Her cannon was destabilizing. Zhou Jingli was in similarly bad shape. Blood oozed out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Sir Vile Spirit trembled from head to toe. The flame of his life force was flickering weakly. Sir Star Ring's chains of order had lost much of their luster, and he was having a hard time controlling them. Hordeslayer and Rampart flitted about unstably. They were even reaching the point where they couldn't curse and grumble in their hearts. Exhaustion and injuries spread like a rising tide. God corpses were piling up, but so were the mangled limbs and disfigured corpses of ascendees. And yet, the slaughter continued. Xu Qing was like the ambassador of death, bringing a massacre wherever he went. His space-time cannon erupted, causing numerous instances of space-time to appear around him. He was like a nightmare for the gods. But even terrifying nightmares would end upon waking. Xu Qing and his squadron were getting very tired, and thus, it seemed like that awakening would come sooner rather than later. Thankfully, the instinct to avoid death seemed to be coming even sooner. When about half of the gods had been slaughtered, the survivors began to feel the instinct to flee, rising up from their god souls. After all, their leaders had been captured and mostly killed. Eventually, one god turned and vanished into the void. All living things have the instinct to seek benefit and avoid harm. That was even truer of the gods, if the 2 peak altar gods were still around. They could use their status as superior gods to compel the others to fight. But now, the inherent cold apathy that existed in the bones of the gods prompted them to flee. Soon enough, a second god disappeared. As the moments passed, it happened again and again. The gods began dispersing. The scale of the fighting grew smaller. Eventually, silence filled the battlefield. There wasn't a single god left. Xu Qing and the survivors hovered in the starry sky. They were completely and utterly spent in both mind and body. What was more, their numbers had been reduced. There were no longer over 50 of them. There were now hardly 20, and they were in bad shape. However, each and every survivor had an intensely baleful aura, and their eyes were the color of blood. This group had been with Xu Qing on a long journey. They had experienced the incident in the Heliodora universe. They had seized Ring Source with him. They had pillaged the god prison, and they had fought with him. When they had been given the chance to leave with the other ascendees, they instead chose to stick with Xu Qing. Having survived to this point, they were warriors who had gone through countless trials, and all of them were now elites among elites. Xu Qing looked around at them for a long moment, then hoarsely said, "Let's go." At that point, Xu Qing stopped using the clay fox form. Turning, he shot off into the distance. No one said a thing, but at the same time, they didn't waste any time. Turning into beams of prismatic light, they followed him. Together, they made their way off into the starry sky like a pack of wolves. Letter 1D21, Letter 1D0 F, Letter 1D20 small cap L, Letter 1D04 small cap H, Letter 1D00, Letter 1D18, Letter 1D1B small cap RS, Letter 1D00 small cap R, Letter 1D18, Letter 1D1C small cap B small cap LS small cap H, Letter 1D05, Letter 1D0F, novel free, et. In that manner, time passed. The fighting in the Eastern Theater went on. In fact, it grew more intense. Gods continued to invade from other areas. Cultivator armies that had been waiting and hiding also joined the fighting. The Eastern Theater had truly become a grindstone of flesh and blood. One after another, the Tao flags in various universes crumbled. Entire armies of gods transformed into corpses. Countless cultivators were buried in the starry sky, including all of the ascendees who had left Xu Qing and the rest of the squadron. Ascendees were like seeds, but in war, they didn't count for much. And that was because only the true seeds would end up growing. Those who died were not truly seeds. The glow of blood grew stronger in the Eastern Theater. It became like a torch in the night, attracting more and more attention. It seemed as if both sides were getting closer and closer to reaching their goal. The two peak altar gods who had gone missing weren't very important at all. The fact that the small squadron of gods didn't make it to the fighting wasn't even noticed. When bright light shines, dust can't be seen. Similarly, as the light grew brighter, no one noticed Xu Qing and his exhausted squadron fleeing into the darkness. Slowly but surely, they approached the border between the staging areas and the front lines of the Eastern Theater. The closer they got, the emptier the starry sky became, and the weaker the mutagen. At a certain point, the mutagen disappeared entirely, and they could sense that they were surrounded by immortal energy. Everyone looked around in surprise. They had left the staging areas. They were now on the front lines of the Eastern Theater. Off in the distance, they could see the massive ramparts that had been erected by the magical techniques of the cultivators. The ramparts went on forever and ever, glittering with bright light. "We're finally here," Zhou Jingli murmured. His eyes were bloodshot and he was badly wounded. For the most part, it was the same with everyone. As they looked at the distant cultivator ramparts, they breathed sighs of relief. The starry sky here was dazzling, and because the Tao flags were all in place, there was no mutagen. The immortal energy was strong. Because of that immortal energy, Xu Qing and the rest of the squadron felt their injuries starting to heal even faster than before. That said, they still weren't completely safe, so they continued moving forward toward the protective magical techniques. About 2 hours later, they were very close to the ramparts. That was when a vast stream of divine will emerged from the ramparts and covered them. Along with the will came a flabbergasted voice. "Who goes there?" It spoke into the minds of Xu Qing and the others like heavenly thunder, forcing them to stop in place. Xu Qing stepped forward. "We're a squadron from the Department of Acquisitions in the Nineshores, Heaven, here on orders from Immortal Lord Nineshores to deliver the ring source we have acquired to the front lines." Chapter 1237, Lieutenant General. The border between the staging areas of the Eastern Theater and the front lines consisted of magnificent, never-ending ramparts. The walls glittered with dazzling light as they spanned galaxies and universes. They served to completely isolate the staging areas from the front lines. At a certain point along those endless ramparts, Xu Qing's hoarse voice rang out. The exhaustion in his voice matched the exhaustion that the 18 surviving members of his squadron couldn't hide. They stood there quietly as the majestic will from the ramparts scanned them, and they could sense their identity medallions responding to the inspection. From a distance, they were insignificant in comparison to the ramparts. After their identities had been verified, the will slowly retracted. Then the walls rippled and an opening appeared. It was a small path. On the other side of the path, beyond the opening, were over 100 cultivators, just barely visible, but clearly looking closely at the group. They seemed surprised. Xu Qing took little note of their facial expressions. He could guess why they were reacting this way. We're probably the only squadron that made it through. Without any hesitation, Xu Qing flew onto the path, followed by Zhou Jingli and everyone else. After they were all on the path, the opening disappeared, and the ramparts went back to the way they were before, glittering and impassable. Inside the ramparts was gentle starlight and strong immortal energy. After Xu Qing and everyone was present, the more than 100 cultivators unblurred, making their facial features and expressions clear. Their gazes were those of astonishment and curiosity, leaving Xu Qing and the others feeling like they were rare oddities. Xu Qing became more convinced than ever of his theory. Looking at the assembled cultivators, he said, "Where do we hand over the ring source?" A middle-aged cultivator in black armor stepped forth, looked them over, and finally fixed his gaze on Xu Qing. "The Lieutenant General has summoned you. My squadron will escort you there safely." Xu Qing's heart thumped in his chest. Given his previous experience in cultivator wars, he knew a bit about how the departments and ranks worked. He was aware that Immortal Lord Deepgloom was in charge of the war effort and made major strategic decisions. Beneath him were 3 ministers of war, who commanded the 3 major war zones, those being the Eastern Theater, the Central Theater, and the Western Theater. Responsibilities in each of the theaters was divided among several lieutenant generals. In this part of the front lines of the Eastern Theater, the highest-ranking officer would be the lieutenant general. And now, right as they had arrived, he had summoned them for an audience. This just seemed to confirm Xu Qing's theory. Sir Starring and the others exchanged glances. Zhou Jingli's spirit seemed to lift. Finally, Xu Qing said, "We shall follow the orders of the lieutenant general." The middle-aged cultivator nodded slightly. Then, after a moment of consideration, he instructed some of his subordinate cultivators to give some healing medicinal pills to Xu Qing and his people. After that, they blurred into motion. Xu Qing and his people followed. And thus, under the protection of this group of cultivators, they made their way through the front lines of the Eastern Theater toward the Lieutenant General's camp. After their journey through multiple universes, via many teleportations, moving through the front lines seemed like looking at a scroll painting. Along the way, they saw numerous heavenly bodies being gathered to serve as tents. They were packed densely and were too numerous to count. Some heavenly bodies were being dragged across a swirling whirlpool that seemed like rivers, which tugged at the starlight to create a dazzling scene. The flame of the life force within them was astounding, and pulsed with an energy that left Xu Qing and the others shocked. There were also terrifyingly huge Dharma statues trudging through the starry sky, Tao flags hoisted behind their backs. They pulsed with terrifying pressure as they went about various missions. Xu Qing also saw numerous suns. Each sun had a huge face on it that seemed to absorb the heat and fire of the sun and turned it into nutrients. After taking in enough nutrients, The faces would fly up and transform into dazzling butterflies that flapped their wings and flew off into distant parts of the starry sky. THS chapter is updat by N0VI, FIRTAP-ENET. Overall, the cultivators seemed to be waiting in combat readiness. The mood was solemn. If Xu Qing and his squadron had been sent directly to the front lines, they would probably be impressed. But they had just gone through the staging areas and experienced chaos and slaughter. So though these sights were intriguing, they were not shocking. After all, they had gone through a mismatch of mutagen and immortal energy to get here, not to mention the grindstone of flesh and blood. As a result, this place seemed more like the rear echelon. As they went along, Xu Qing and his squadron saw a lot of cultivators. Some stuck to themselves, but others stayed in groups. Everyone had responsibilities, and everything was very orderly. The vast majority of cultivators, after noticing Xu Qing and his group, stared at them as they passed. Xu Qing and his squadron noticed, but didn't react. As they proceeded, they could sense a faint force of rejection coming from the starry sky. It seemed to indicate that they were guests here at the front lines and had not been completely accepted. About half a month later, they reached the heavenly body occupied by the Lieutenant General. It was an extremely bright, red-colored sun. It was larger than any sun Xu Qing had ever seen, so much so that the suns from his Ink Sun universe seemed like dust in comparison. It seemed unstable, as if it was constantly sucking in things from the void around it, all while simultaneously ejecting things at top speed. The result was that there was something like a cloud surrounding it. The pressure weighing down on it distorted the starry sky. The starlight in the area bent as if unable to sustain the force. The end result was that the sun seemed like it might explode at any moment and unleash terrifying power. Strangely, the sun actually wasn't as intensely hot as one might expect. "That's a dying sun," Zhou Jingli said quietly. "It's already gone through its primary life cycle and has become a red giant." Everyone else looked at it, their hearts pounding in astonishment. The cultivators who had escorted them on the journey looked deeply at Xu Qing and the others, then clasped hands and left. Soon, only Xu Qing and his squadron were left in front of the red giant. As the pressure from it weighed down on them, Xu Qing solemnly bowed to it, as did Sir Star Ring and the others. "Our Acquisitioner squad has come to offer greetings, Lieutenant General." Rumbling sounds echoed out from the red giant, and a terrifying aura spread out. The surrounding clouds seethed. Then a black palace appeared, slowly emerging from the red giant into the clouds. A frigid coldness spread from the palace into the starry sky, along with streams of divine will that settled onto Xu Qing and his people. It was another inspection. Each and every stream of divine will caused Xu Qing and everyone else to shiver mentally. It was immortal will. The final stream caused all the others to dim, as if it was far superior to them. Along with it came a calm voice from the hall of the palace. "You're the first group, and perhaps the only group, to make it here to deliver the ring source you acquired. As such, I don't want to forcibly probe your souls to see what you went through. Instead, I'd like you to simply explain. Tell me how you managed to escape that grindstone of flesh and blood." Sir Star Ring and the others instantly got nervous. The use of the word escape seemed ominous. They looked at Xu Qing. Xu Qing's mind raced, but in the end, he chose to simply tell the truth. And so, he explained their experiences along the way, including why they made the decisions they did. He didn't go into explicit detail, he just stuck to the basics. After hearing Xu Qing's explanation, the divine will of the Lieutenant General said nothing. However, one of the other streams of immortal will spoke. "It must not have been easy for your group to stick together through so many setbacks, and in the end, still reach this point to deliver your ring source. It counts as a great service. Although the Lieutenant General doesn't wish to probe you with divine will when it comes to the peak altar god you encountered, do you have proof to back your claim?" Xu Qing's heart and mind stirred. On the surface, it seemed like their story was being questioned. But after everything Xu Qing had experienced in life, he could tell that there was a deeper meaning to the words. Their successful journey counted as a meritorious service, but at the same time, they were being asked to prove what they had done. The real reason for this caused Xu Qing to look at the surviving members of his squadron. Ascendees all had important backgrounds. For any of them to reach this point would require significant backers, and those backers were now more important than ever. The key to the whole thing is how he mentioned, sticking together. After some thought, Xu Qing waved his hand. His cannon rippled, and infinite timelessness opened. The imprisoned peak altar god was now visible for everyone to see. It was possible to see wounds inflicted by various types of cannon, and the iron skewer embedded in the god's forehead pulsed with fluctuations of suppression. This explained everything. Xu Qing immediately said, "I could not have captured this peak altar god on my own. We worked together." Suddenly, Xu Qing heard laughter. It was the lieutenant general in the palace. "You're an interesting bunch, I'll give you that. You experienced a lot of twists and turns crossing the field of battle. It was obviously extremely difficult to deliver the ring source and accomplish your mission. It definitely counts as a major service. Slaughtering a host of gods and capturing a peak altar god counts as further service. Well then, you might as well stay here in the Eastern Theater Army." As the lieutenant general's voice echoed out, the red giant rumbled, and the black palace sank back down into its depths. All that remained behind was a command medallion that flew over and hovered in front of Xu Qing. There was also a final bit of divine will that said, "Go to planet Spirit Restoration and wait for an assignment." Xu Qing and the others bowed their heads. "Yes, sir, Lieutenant General." Xu Qing reached out and took the medallion. As soon as he did, the force of rejection from the starry sky vanished. They were no longer just guests. Xu Qing breathed a sigh of relief. So did Zhou Jingli, Sir Star Ring, and everyone else. They exchanged glances. Given all that they had experienced, they now felt relief. They had been turned from acquisitioners into transporters and had been sent to the field of battle. That mission had been accomplished. They had paid a heavy price. They had started out more than 100 strong. Now, they didn't even have 20. "This is how ascendees are trained," Zhou Jingli said quietly. "Only those who survive until the very end can truly become Dao seeds." Chapter 12:38, Mission Please. After Xu Qing took the medallion, he then handed over the ring source. Then they left the red giant and disappeared into the starry sky. After they were gone, the huge red sun continued to emit both mist and bright light. Inside of the sun, in the ancient, pitch-black palace, a sigh drifted out. "I never imagined the pawns would actually manage to cross the river. And they're ascendees. Now that I've seen them personally, I guess it's not too surprising they made it this far. The question is whether or not any of them have the potential to become true Dao seeds. Or are they just pale imitations, one? It's the same with us, after all. With the exception of the esteemed general, all of us are ascendees, and we're still finding our path. It's been many years since the immortal Paragon's decree, and though immortals like us have proliferated, there has yet to be any new immortal lord." More sighs could be heard in the palace hall. As time passed, none of the immortals there said anything. Eventually, the lieutenant general spoke in a hoarse voice. "It's easy to start a new endeavor, but it's not as easy to keep it going. That's how things work in the mortal world, and it's the same with cultivators in the 5th star ring." The immortals present all understood that truth. In fact, they understood it better than most. It was especially true in the 5th star ring. In the past, the star ring had been controlled by gods and ruled by a god paragon. Eventually, the immortal paragon struggled into prominence, leading humans from a minor world to carve out a path for cultivators and a Dao for immortals. They advanced step by step through countless hardships and tribulations, slaughtering minor worlds and gods along the way. Ultimately, they crushed the god paragon, imprisoned the god lords, and severed the origins of all gods. They enslaved countless members of the godfolk and hewed out 12 heavens beyond heaven in the 5th star ring. Then, in the very middle of it all, they enshrined the immortal capital with its crucial mission. And that mission was to eventually turn all of the 36 higher star rings into places like the 5th, in other words, places that belonged to humans and cultivators. There was no way a task like that could be described as easy. No, it was something extremely difficult, and even more difficult than starting such a task was to continue working on it long-term. And that was especially true, considering that the person who was originally supposed to be the second immortal paragon had perished. Immortal Lord Aurora. When he died, it cast doubt on the future of the entire fifth star ring. After all, with the exception of the fifth star ring and a couple of other very special star rings, all star rings were the home of gods. And though the fifth star ring seemed like a place bursting with life and activity, the reality was that it was already past its zenith and on the decline. The only way to change that was for a second immortal paragon to rise up in the fifth star ring. Before another immortal paragon could rise up, there needed to be another immortal lord. And that was the reason for all the rigorous training the Ascendees went through over all the years. It was a brutal arrangement. Fostering cultivators who eventually ascended from the immortal capital was a process similar to raising venomous bugs in a jar. It didn't matter what fate or karma had in store, those who died were considered nothing but imitations. Those who lived were the true Tao seeds, and those who continued on to the end would be kindred spirits in philosophy. I just hope the day will come soon. It doesn't matter which generation that person comes from, as long as they're human and as long as they're a cultivator. Time passed as Xu Qing, and the others remained on the front lines of the Eastern Theater. In a flash, 3 months went by. During that time, the grindstone of flesh and blood continued to turn, casting red light onto all of the battlefields in the Eastern Theater. Xu Qing and the others didn't know how the war was faring overall. However, the ebb and flow of events on the front lines gave them an idea of how things were going. The action in the staging areas was reaching a critical point. That much was clear because of the lack of movement among the military forces on the front lines. On a snowy mountain full of immortal energy on planet Spirit Restoration, Xu Qing and the rest were gathered around a fire pit. Snow drifted down calmly from above as Zhou Jingli said. It indicates the event is almost complete. Based on the information I've been able to gather, there are more small-scale clashes with gods on the true front lines. It seems likely that we'll be getting our mission soon. That's the extent of what I've been able to learn. The snow brought cold with it. However, the heat from the fire pit melted the snow, creating a mist that filled the area. They were surrounded by snowy mountains in all directions. In fact, if one took in planet Spirit Restoration as a whole, they would see that it was full of numerous snowy mountains. There were a lot of them. Atop every single mountain, there was a fire pit blazing with red fire. The flames danced, letting out both heat as well as something else very mysterious. Whatever that mysterious power was, it helped cultivators to recover from injuries and rebuild strength. After spending 3 months on the planet, Xu Qing and the others had long since recovered. In fact, they had only stayed atop the mountain for the first month. After that, they had scattered and had spent 2 months in other places, only returning at specific times to touch bases. Today was their 3rd time meeting up again. After Zhou Jingli was done speaking, Li Mengtu took a turn. The information I got led me in a different direction than Zhou Jingli. I wanted to find out if anyone else made it through the staging areas in the last few months. None did. Li Mengtu knew he wasn't very good at digging for information, so he had chosen a much simpler task. When he was done with his report, he looked around at the others. Whenever they regrouped, they would share any information they had uncovered, then come up with a new plan before parting ways again. In that way, they were able to gain an understanding of the front lines much more quickly. Yuan Shensu, Sir Vile Spirit, Horde Slayer, Rampart, and everyone else took turns sharing what they had learned. Finally, it was Sir Star Ring's turn. He looked at Xu Qing. I looked into those people you mentioned last time we met up, and I learned a thing or two. Xu Qing turned to look at Sir Star Ring. Of course, Xu Qing had gone out just like the rest of them, and had used his own methods of getting information on the front lines. At a certain point, he had noticed some cultivators who seemed to belong to a special army organization. They seemed similar to the Department of Acquisitions, but were very secretive and had very few dealings with anyone outside of their organization. As a result, Xu Qing wasn't able to interact with them much. However, he was very curious about them and had let everyone else know they should pay attention and try to get information if they could. They form an auxiliary force in the army, made up of 50 squadrons. They operate on the front lines, specifically in locations where battles are fought with the gods. They're called the Corpsedrainer Division. Their mission is simple. They clear battlefields. They go to front-line positions where the bodies of dead gods are located, and they collect ring source and other loot. Similar to Acquisitioners, they can keep a bit for themselves. The more battles are fought, the more active they are. That's been especially true over the last month, as there have been a lot of skirmishes with the 4th Star Ring forces. Virtually all of their forces have been sent in that direction. Looking closely at Xu Qing, Sir Star Ring said, "Why exactly did you want us to pay attention to them?" Xu Qing looked around thoughtfully at the small group. They had gone through a lot together, so he was very familiar with them at this point. "It's been 3 months since we handed in our ring source and got sent here to rest and recover," he said. "During that time, the Lieutenant General hasn't made any arrangements for us. So I was thinking that, instead of waiting for an assignment, we could take the initiative and find something to do. Maybe we could even apply for a specific position. I've almost run out of ring source to use for cultivation. I'm guessing you're all in similar positions, right? If we don't replenish our stock, it'll affect our cultivation progress." In response, Sir Star Ring's eyes glittered. Zhou Jingli smiled faintly. Sir Vilespirit licked his lips. And the brothers Hordeslayer and Rampart emitted faint sounds like the humming of swords. Even the normally reserved Yuanshan Su seemed excited. The other ascendees reacted similarly. Their baleful auras pulsed, causing the snowflakes in the sky to turn black. Li Mengtu was the first to speak. "That's exactly what I've been wanting to do." Content originally comes from Novelfira.net. He seemed to have given voice to what everyone was thinking, as their eyes glowed like wolves in a wolf pack. All of these people had fought tooth and nail to ascend from the immortal capital. They had gone through all sorts of deadly training, and were like blood fiends who were ruthless to the core. In the 3 months that had passed, they had been hard-pressed to remain patient. It was only natural that they responded enthusiastically to Xu Qing's suggestion. Seeing their reaction prompted a nod from Xu Qing. Not wanting to waste any time, he stood and solemnly took out the command medallion from the Lieutenant General. Then his immortal embryo glittered as he sent some immortal will into the medallion. It became a Tao voice that caused the medallion to tremble. "This is Xu Qing, leader of the former Acquisitioner Squadron and now Transporter Squadron. I would like to submit a petition to the Lieutenant General. My squadron is fully recovered and well-rested. We're in peak condition now. We have been emboldened by seeing our fellow soldiers slaying gods on the front lines, and would thus like to submit an application for a new mission. We are willing to go to the battlefields of the front line as a Corpsedrainer Squadron. We would like to continue our previous mission of acquiring ring source." Everyone else stood in anticipation. However, there was no response from the command medallion. Xu Qing's immortal will disappeared like a stone ox thrown into the ocean. Everyone, including Xu Qing, stood there waiting patiently. About an hour passed. Then the medallion vibrated. Red light shot out from it, surrounding them, and along with it came a stream of majestic immortal will. "Approved." "Yes, Sir Lieutenant General," Xu Qing said loudly. Everyone else voiced the same words. The red light shone into the wind and snow like the rising sun. 1. The Pons River is a reference to Chinese chess. Note, Chinese chess, transliterated Xianxia, translated elephant chess, is not the game of Go. Go is transliterated Waiki and is directly translated as encirclement chess, and it has simple black and white stones that you use to carve out territory on the board. In contrast, Chinese chess Xianxia has pieces that correlate to members of an army, similar to international chess. One big difference in Chinese chess is that there's a river in the middle of the board. When a pawn crosses the river, it usually signifies a big change in the game. For one thing, the pawn gains additional abilities when it crosses the river. Beyond that, crossing the river usually signifies an advancement beyond the opening or middle game. Incidentally, Nowadays, Chinese chess is much more popular and common than Go. You will see people, usually old guys, playing the game on the street or in the park. Even in overseas Chinese communities, the game is popular. Back when I lived in Chinatown in Manhattan, I remember seeing old dudes playing the game in the park all the time. In fact, here's a picture I took in a Chinatown park in around 2009 of a bunch of guys gathered around a Chinese chess game. Chapter 12, 39, Corpse-Drainer Squadron. The war was heating up in the Eastern Theater. Fighting was breaking out all over the place. Sparks flew. The scale of the fighting wasn't very large. Most battles were skirmishes involving about 1,000 combatants, but the number of battles was growing. Of course, war had to be judged as a whole, and there was a reason for everything that was happening. It didn't matter if it was large-scale battles or minor skirmishes, they all played out for specific reasons. And if those various goals were met, then it would build up momentum to reach the biggest goal of all. That was the essence of war. It was like a game. For example, the information brought in by Xu Qing and everyone else seemed to point to the same conclusion. The event in the staging areas of the Eastern Theater was over. At the same time, more skirmishes were breaking out on the front lines. Given that, the goal was obvious. Both gods and cultivators were using the skirmishes to hide their true motives. At the moment, as sparks were flying because of all the skirmishes, there was one battlefield located in an asteroid belt. The fighting was bloody. Taking in the scene as a whole, rumbling booms echoed out, rubble sprayed everywhere, and mutagen clashed with immortal energy constantly. One side was making an incursion. The other side was trying to stop them. It was a very intense situation. Beyond the periphery of the fighting, amongst some scattered asteroids, a group of people was observing the battlefield. There were a few hundred of them, all wearing gray and black garments. They looked like vultures, their eyes glittering as they kept a close eye on their surroundings. Clearly, they were ready to fall back if the fighting got too close to them. One of them, an old man, was talking to some cultivators standing around him. Read full story at novelfire.net. I was right, eh? I knew this fight wouldn't end quickly. My guess is that it'll keep going for at least another hour. You know, if I hadn't noticed you a few months ago and also sensed your command medallion just now, I wouldn't have called you over here. The cultivators around him all had baleful auras that were surprising even to him. That was especially true of their leader, who had the strongest baleful aura of all. You know, you're actually pretty famous for getting through the staging areas to the front lines. But since you're part of the logistics division now, there are some things you need to understand. The people around him were, of course, Xu Qing and the other ascendees. After their request for a mission was approved, they had been assigned to this location and had arrived only about 4 hours ago. However, before they could get close to the battlefield, this old man had stopped them. He was also a corpse-drainer. Being aware of who Xu Qing and the other ascendees were, he had shown them some goodwill by inviting them over. In response to his words, Xu Qing and Sir Star Ring exchanged a glance, then clasped hands, bowed, and sincerely asked for more information. The old man nodded. Technically speaking, we're part of the logistics division, but that's just the official, nice-sounding version of what we are. As you know, everybody calls us corpse-drainers. Considering we clean up after battles, it only makes sense that we have to wait until the fighting is over before we start working. If we didn't, then we wouldn't be corpse-drainers. We would be actually fighting in the war. Remember, the fighting is done by the army cultivators. We don't take part. We only go in after the fighting. That's because, if we went in too soon, it could affect the strategy and tactics of the army cultivators. What's more, part of our mission is to make sure that our army cultivators have a path of retreat if they suffer a defeat. The old man clearly took his responsibilities very seriously. Xu Qing and everyone else nodded solemnly. Truth be told, they hadn't intended to go onto the battlefield. They had just wanted to get close enough to be in the position to get ring source as quickly as possible. After all, they believed themselves to be quite skilled at acquiring ring source. They had quite a bit of experience due to their time in the Department of Acquisitions. During that time, they had managed to meet all their quotas, but had also been able to siphon off plenty of ring source for their own use. The difference was that they had taken ring source from living targets before. This would be their first time harvesting it from dead gods. When the old man saw how attentive Xu Qing and the others were being, he relaxed a bit and cleared his throat. Everything I just said is the official position of the army. In reality, we don't really need to guard the escape routes, and if we do go onto the battlefield, there's almost no chance we would affect the army. Now I'll tell you the real deal. The truth is that we don't want to go onto the battlefield too early because, for all we know, it might get us killed. Once the fighting starts to wrap up, things are a lot safer. Of course, it's hard to predict how things will end in war, so we need to always be ready to evacuate if our side ends up losing. You lot are just too young and inexperienced. If I hadn't stopped you just now, you would have gone too close to the fighting, and that would have put you in a lot of danger. Another thing you should keep in mind is that you should never get into conflicts with the army cultivators, as... All of a sudden, Xu Qing's expression flickered. He, along with Sir Star Ring and the others, all looked over at the battlefield. The old man stopped talking and did the same. They saw a huge swell of immortal energy and could hear cheering. Then a Dao flag was hoisted up. "Victory," the old man said, his eyes lighting up. Not bothering to go into any further detail about the rules, he shot forward. "Let's get to work, everybody." As he led the way, the squadron under his command flew forward like vultures who had spread their wings. Xu Qing and the others followed. In short order, they slashed into the asteroid belt like sharp blades. Within the rubble, they saw god corpses and god blood everywhere, as well as severed limbs and destroyed treasures. There were quite a few cultivator corpses as well. The cultivator army had already moved on, although a few warriors had remained behind to collect ring source. The old man and his subordinates didn't seem surprised by that. They didn't even glance at the warriors as they swarmed over the unattended corpses. Some cut things apart, some focused on collections, some stored up the gains. They worked together smoothly and with great speed. They were obviously very used to this. Only a few dozen breaths later, they had already cleared much of the battlefield. The god corpses were collected up, but the cultivator corpses were treated with great respect. Xu Qing and the others looked on with astonishment. Zhou Jingli and the other top ascendees suddenly felt great respect. There was no doubt that the old man and his subordinates had pushed their harvesting skills to the point of perfection. Their speed was nothing short of stupefying. "These people are on a different level when it comes to looting corpses," someone said. "They're totally beyond us." Xu Qing and the others exchanged glances, then hurried onto the battlefield to start working. Despite having a background in the Department of Acquisitions, compared to the old man and his people, they couldn't compete in terms of speed and thoroughness. Furthermore, these gods were dead, so the ring source in them wasn't very active. The levels were also much lower than in living gods, which meant that it took a lot of work. Thankfully, there were plenty of corpses. Obviously, getting a lot of ring source would involve dealing with a lot of corpses. The corpse drainers had their own set of rules. Once someone started working on the corpse of a god, no one would interfere, even if they were taking a long time. Xu Qing realized that quickly, and made sure to abide by the rules. And yet, there were still conflicts. They weren't conflicts between corpse drainers, but with the army cultivators. The army cultivators were bossy and domineering, and when it came to collecting the corpses, they were rude and unreasonable. They didn't make any attempt to hide their disdain of the corpse drainers. It made sense considering that their army was the one who had killed these gods. But there were official arrangements for the resources and battle trophies of war, so there was no grounds for the army cultivators to do much. What usually happened was that after army forces won a battle and moved on, they would leave some people behind to collect some loot, all for the purpose of keeping morale up. Such practices were tacitly approved of. The corpse drainers were used to it, and would usually just rely on their speed to make up for the difference. Xu Qing and the Ascendees had just started as corpse drainers, so they were clearly not as fast as the others. As a result, they were the first ones the army cultivators targeted. A few hours later, the massive battlefield was almost totally cleared. The corpses of the cultivators had been attended to properly and taken away by the army. The corpses of the gods had been collected, with the old man and the corpse-drainers getting about 60% of them. The army cultivators got about 30%. The final 10% went to Xu Qing and the Ascendees. When the battlefield was cleared, the army cultivators left. Xu Qing and the Ascendees were left muttering a bit discontentedly. Seeing that, the old man came over with a broad smile on his face. "You don't seem too happy. Feel like you got robbed? You'll figure things out soon enough. In the end, they did kill these gods, so it's not unusual at all for them to take some of the corpses. Things will get better for you as you learn to go faster." With that, the old man bade farewell and led his subordinates away. Xu Qing and the Ascendees were now alone in the asteroid belt. They didn't feel any less discontent. The old man had misjudged them. Their discontent wasn't because they had performed poorly or were angry. It was true that the army had slain these gods, so it was completely justifiable for them to take the corpses as loot. After all, if the Ascendees were in that position, they would be irritated if other people showed up and took the corpses of the gods they had slaughtered. No, they were discontent for a different reason. "We're not as fast as the other corpse-drainers, and we have no right to get in arguments with the army cultivators. Since the corpse-drainers can only start working after the fighting is over. Maybe we should just go on to the battlefield earlier." Everyone exchanged glances and their eyes were glittering. Chapter 1240, Side Hustle. The same mysterious light glittered in the eyes of Xu Qing and all the Ascendees. They had not done well in this, their first time clearing a battlefield. After they handed in their corpse-drainer quota, they would hardly have any ring source left for cultivation purposes. Everyone slowly looked over at Xu Qing. They were waiting for his final decision. He scanned the empty battlefield, and then the distant starry sky. Finally, he said, "Entering the field of battle early is definitely an option, but we need to find the right opportunity, and we need to make sure we have a clear assessment of the battle prowess of both sides. Things can change very quickly on the battlefield, and if our timing is wrong, we could end up in a deadly situation. After all, we're not strong enough yet to be able to crush all opposition." Xu Qing suppressed the urge to be impulsive. He knew that this was a situation in which hasty decisions weren't a good idea. The glow in the eyes of the other Ascendees began to fade. However, that was when Sir Vilespirit licked his lips and said, "Captain, the truth is we're better at dealing with living gods than dead ones. You can harvest more ring source from the live ones." The glow returned to the eyes of the Ascendees. They understood what Sir Vilespirit was getting at. He was suggesting they start hunting gods. They were also thinking about the god prisons they had been to. When Xu Qing heard someone calling him Captain, it left him feeling a bit dazed. It was actually the first time anyone had addressed him that way so far. I wonder what eldest brother is up to right now. Meanwhile, Sir Star Ring said, "You can't accomplish anything without rules. We're not acquisitioners anymore. We're corpse-drainers." Sir Vilespirit's eyes glittered as he coldly replied, "And can you really do better than those other corpse-drainers? They got 60% of the corpses. Sir Star Ring, your order isn't going to help at all when it comes to draining corpses." Sir Star Ring glared back coldly at Sir Vilespirit. Sir Vilespirit wasn't about to shrink in the face of that, so he pulsed with a baleful aura and faint quasi-immortal fluctuations. Everyone had improved to certain degrees recently. As for Sir Vilespirit, he had broken through into the quasi-immortal level. As the two Ascendees glared at each other, Xu Qing looked at Zhou Jingli. Zhou Jingli cleared his throat, stepped forward to stand between Sir Star Ring and Sir Vilespirit, and then bowed to Xu Qing. "Your Majesty, we know your primary concern is keeping us alive, but we've made it all the way here to the battlefield. We've gone through a lot, and we know that rewards come only with risk. As long as the potential gains are worth it, we don't mind taking risks. In fact, that's the best way to get what we need. Therefore, what fellow Taoist Vilespirit just said about targeting the living is true. But so is what fellow Taoist Star Ring said about rules. I think we could probably find a compromise here." Zhou Jingli licked his lips and continued, "We're corpse-drainers, sure. But if we hunted down some gods and turned them into dead bodies, then collected them, well, that wouldn't be a conflict, would it? We don't have to look for a battlefield, we can make one. We don't have to look for corpses, we can make them. With that, Zhou Jingli bowed again to Xu Qing. Sir Vilespirit's eyes glittered as he also bowed. The other ascendees said nothing, but their eyes glittered as they, too, bowed. Sir Star Ring thought about it for a moment, then nodded and looked at Xu Qing. Xu Qing looked around at them. He knew that everyone present had their own goals and motives. What was more, they were not greenhouse flowers. They had been born amidst foul winds and raining blood. They were running out of ring source and were getting antsy to devour gods, given all that. Xu Qing's eyes flashed with determination, and he nodded. In response, the other ascendees smiled like wolves that had been let out of their cages. Zhou Jingli made some final arrangements, and then they scattered. They would use their own various talents to try to find targets, and would send information back for Zhou Jingli and Sir Star Ring to consider. As for Xu Qing, he sat down cross-legged on an asteroid to wait. Half a month passed by. Information continued to pour in from the various ascendees, all of it related to the activities of various gods. However, the vast majority of situations didn't seem suitable to Xu Qing. Either there were too many gods present, or the scenarios were just too risky. Roughly a week passed. That was when one of the ascendees named Taoist Bloodcloud sent information about a situation that seemed promising. Sir Star Ring and Zhou Jingli studied the message to confirm its authenticity, then forwarded the information to Xu Qing. Captain, I found a team of scouts about 30 in number. The most powerful is a mid-altar god. Definitely godfolk. I've been secretly following them for about 2 days. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they seem perfect for our purposes. Xu Qing considered it. Then his baleful aura surged as he sent out orders. After that, he stepped out into the void and disappeared. The other Asundas in different areas got the orders, whereupon their eyes glittered. And then, like a pack of vicious wolves, they raced toward the location. Toachus chapter is update by Novel Nut. A few days later, near a planet called Grutum, Xu Qing and the Asundas met up. Taoist Bloodcloud had been waiting for them there. As Xu Qing arrived, flanked by Sir Star Ring and Zhou Jingli, Taoist Bloodcloud bowed. Captain, this group of gods is well hidden. However, I happen to have a special magic that lets me sense them. I followed them here, and this is where they've been for the past few days. In order to avoid detection, I didn't go onto the planet, but I'm certain that's where they are. Sir Star Ring nodded. I can sense great chaos in the area. Zhou Jingli licked his lips and smiled. Your Majesty, my canon is informing me that Thuk is still there. If the information had been coming from Taoist Bloodcloud alone, Xu Qing would have wanted further proof. But since Sir Star Ring and Zhou Jingli were corroborating the details, it seemed much more likely to be accurate. As Xu Qing looked at the planet, his immortal embryo stirred, and his canon of spacetime spread out. In that way, he was able to confirm the situation on his own as well. We strike quickly, he said in a cold voice. Collect the rungsas as fast as possible. Everybody, let's go. The Asundas surged with baleful auras as they rushed toward the planet. Over a dozen beams of light shot through the clouds and headed toward the gods at top speed. Xu Qing was among them, and he was going all out to approach the target destination. There were over 30 gods present, including the altar god. And upon nearing, the Asundas were able to see what they were doing. They were performing some sort of ceremony around an octagonal altar. Astonishingly, there was a black bowl in the middle of the table. Inside the bowl was blood, and it was bubbling as if boiling. The boiling blood was causing an intense mutagen to form, and it seemed to be building up toward some sort of detonation point. When Xu Qing and the Asundas arrived, the gods looked up in surprise. The altar god's pupils constricted. The god altar isn't complete, the ceremony hasn't started, the mutagen hasn't erupted. The foundation is still forming. How could cultivators have shown up already? The altar god was surprised, but acted decisively. Godly authority flared, causing the unfinished altar to burst into flames early. The black bowl of blood suddenly shattered. Massive amounts of mutagen spilled out like roiling black smoke. It was supposed to infect everything in the area. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough, so the effect wasn't as good as it should have been, making it unclear whether or not a new battlefield could form here. However, Ha had no other options. At almost the exact same instant that the god aura surged out, the Asundas, who had been holding their longing in check for quite a while now, unleashed everything at their disposal. Down they descended like razor-sharp blades. Xu Qing extended his hand, and his immortal embryo emerged, blocking out everything as its palm dropped. Its aura shook all of the gods to the core and immediately covered the effects of the bowl of blood. The black mutagen fell under its power and was crushed. A cracking sound rang out as the mutagen smoke seemed to solidify and then break. At the same time, the crimson eye manifestation of Zhou Zhengli's cannon opened. Xianxia's heavy mountains descended. Sir Volsparet cackled as he rushed forth with killing intent and devilishness. Li Mengta's poison swirled while Hudasla and Rampart shone with astonishing sword light. The slaughter was commencing. In the starry sky some distance away from planet Grutum, a group of army cultivators were on patrol. They were one of the 9 great army corps in the Eastern Theater's front lines. They were the Lungskull Regiment, who served as vanguard troops when assigned to battle. During peaceful times, they would go on patrol to look for gods in hiding and to clear areas of mutagen. There were a bit over 1,000 members, organized into battalions of roughly 100. Currently, the battalions were seated cross-legged atop enormous green flying ships. The 10 flying ships flew the banners of the Lungskull Regiment as they sailed majestically through the starry sky. When the black bowl of blood shattered at planet Grutum, the sound of drums suddenly echoed out from the lead ship. The sudden, deafening noise shook the starry sky and caused all of the cultivators on the ships to open their eyes. A solemn voice then echoed out. Gods are erecting an altar to serve as a foundation for a mutagen assault. That is why the god-crushing drums have sounded. Profound, Overlook, Ink, Spirit, Wing. You 5 battalions will follow the direction of the drums to inspect the area ahead. Find the altar and destroy everything there. 5 of the flying ships shifted directions and then flew off in the direction indicated. Yes, sir,